Close your eyes and let your imagination drift back. Far before the longships cut across stormy seas, before the Viking name spread across distant shores, there was a land at the edge of the world. A place of contrasts. A place that would forge a people unlike any other. This is the beginning of their story. The northern lands of Scandinavia were not gentle to those who lived upon them. They were wild, unpredictable, and demanding. Towering mountains sliced across the horizon, their peaks often cloaked in snow even during the warmer months. Narrow fjords, vast waterways carved by the hands of ancient glaciers, cut deep into the rugged coastline. These fjords were at once beautiful and menacing, mirrors of dark water reflecting skies that never settled. In summer, the sun itself seemed reluctant to leave, lingering on the edge of the horizon. Days stretched endlessly, and nights became little more than a soft twilight glow. In the far north, the phenomenon was even more profound. The midnight sun, where day never truly gave way to night. Crops could grow quickly, almost furiously, racing against the brief warmth of the season. But then came winter. Winter in Scandinavia was not merely a season. It was a ruler, one that imposed its will with ice and shadow. The sun retreated, hiding for months behind a shroud of darkness. The long nights were absolute, swallowing the land in cold silence. The seas froze, the fields lay barren, and the forests stood silent under heavy snow. To live here meant to adapt. The land was both cradle and test, sculpting its people with unrelenting discipline. The Norse were not born of comfort, they were born of survival. Unlike the fertile valleys of the Mediterranean or the broad river plains of Mesopotamia, Scandinavia gave little freely. The soil was thin, often stony, fit only for certain grains, barley, rye, oats. The growing season was short and harvests uncertain. Herding animals, cattle, goats, sheep, was possible, but they too needed fodder, and fodder was limited. Scarcity was the constant companion of the early Norse. It shaped their worldview, sharpening them into a people of efficiency and resilience. Nothing was wasted. A hunted animal provided not just meat, but hide for clothing, bones for tools, sinew for string. Wood from the forest became firewood, planks, even children's toys. Each resource stretched to its fullest use. Contrast this with Rome, or Greece, or the southern kingdoms. Those lands had abundance, warm climates, rich farmland, sprawling cities with markets full of olive oil, figs, wine. In the north, survival hinged not on luxury, but on discipline. This difference, between abundance and scarcity, would be etched into the Viking character. Where Mediterranean societies developed elaborate philosophies and monuments, the Norse invested in practicality, endurance, and a deep-rooted community spirit. If the land was demanding, the sea was both enemy and ally. Scandinavia is a world surrounded by water, jagged coastlines, countless islands, rivers that cut into the land like veins. For the Norse, the sea was unavoidable. At first, it was sustenance. Fish filled their nets, herring, cod, salmon, eels. Shellfish could be gathered along the rocky shores. Even seaweed became a resource, fed to livestock or used as fertilizer for poor soil. But soon, the sea became more than food. It became a teacher. Children learned early to balance in narrow boats, to read the tide, to sense the mood of waves and winds. Every family needed some familiarity with the water, for rivers and fjords were often easier to traverse than the thick forests and rugged mountains. And so long before the Viking Age, a maritime culture began to take shape. The Norse were not yet the masters of longships, but the seed was planted. The sea was not a barrier, it was a road waiting to be traveled. At the heart of survival in these lands was not the individual, but the household. The Norse family was not merely parents and children. It was an extended unit, often several generations under one roof, along with servants, thralls, and sometimes foster children. The household was the core of economic life. Each member had a role to play. Men hunted, fished, plowed, and built. Women brewed, wove, tended livestock, and managed stores. This was not a rigid hierarchy, but a web of cooperation. And interestingly, women held a notable degree of autonomy compared to their counterparts in many other societies of the time. A wife might manage the household in her husband's absence, oversee trade, or control inheritance. Her keys, the literal iron keys that jingled at her belt, were symbols of authority, granting her command over the home's stores and treasures. In this way, survival demanded balance. While men might face danger on the hunt or the sea, women ensured that life at home continued, that food was preserved, that children were nurtured, that the fragile thread of survival was never broken. These households did not exist in isolation. Scattered across valleys, nestled by fjords, perched on coastal edges, small settlements began to form. They were modest in size, often just a few families, but together they represented the first fabric of Norse society. Unlike the great cities of the south, these communities had no towering palaces or crowded streets. Instead, they carried an egalitarian spirit born from necessity. Every hand mattered. A lazy farmer could mean starvation for all. A skilled craftsman could mean warmth and safety. Thus, competence was valued over status. Practical ability earned respect more than lineage alone. Disputes arose, of course, but the small scale of life required resolution, not endless conflict. This was the seat of the thing, the assembly where free men gathered to decide matters of law and justice, a tradition that would later define Norse governance. The society that grew from this soil was one where endurance was honored, where skill was prized, and where every voice had some weight. Perhaps the most profound trait of these early Norse was their connection to the land itself. They saw the mountains and forests not as resources alone, but as living presences. The land was both harsh and sacred, a partner in their existence. Stones were raised as markers, trees were venerated, waters were believed to house spirits. This connection extended into death. Burial practices revealed a reverence for both the individual and their environment. Graves might include tools, weapons, or ornaments, items the departed would need in the next life, a reflection of their earthly bond to home, family, and land. Some were buried in boats, symbolizing that even in death, the sea remained a pathway to new journeys. It was a worldview rooted in respect, but also in necessity. The Norse knew their survival was intertwined with the cycles of nature, with the will of seasons, with the mercy of storm and soil. This awareness created a culture that was not only resilient, but deeply attuned to the rhythms of their world. Unlike the gods of the Mediterranean, distant, serene, perched above humanity in perfect forms, the Norse gods were strikingly human. They quarreled, they schemed, they suffered, they laughed. They could bleed, they could falter, and even they were bound by fate. The Norse pantheon was not flawless divinity, but rather a reflection of the unpredictable world its people inhabited. Just as the northern weather could bless with sunlight one moment and punish with storms the next, so too were the gods both protectors and tricksters, wise and foolish, noble and flawed. This realism gave them power. For the people of the fjords and forests, these gods were not abstractions but companions in the struggle for life. To tell their stories was to make sense of snow and thunder, of loss and love, of war and peace. At the heart of Norse belief was a creation myth as stark and raw as the land itself. Before there was anything, there was Ginnungagap, the yawning void. On one side of this emptiness lay Niflheim, the realm of ice, frost, and bitter cold. On the other side burned Muspelheim, the realm of fire, sparks, and molten heat. When the cold winds of Niflheim met the fiery sparks of Muspelheim within the void, creation began. From the melting ice emerged Ymir, the first giant, and Audhumla, the great cosmic cow whose milk nourished him. From Ymir's body later, the world itself would be fashioned. His flesh became the earth, his blood the seas, his skull the sky. This tale of creation was no soft pastoral vision. It was a story born of collision, of opposites clashing, of chaos giving birth to form. Just as the Norse lived between blazing summers and endless winters, their cosmos was born from fire and ice. The world shaped from Ymir's body became the stage for the gods, each carrying traits that spoke directly to Norse life and values. At the center stood Odin, the All-Father. He was king of the gods, but not in the manner of a perfect ruler. Odin was complex, even contradictory. He was the god of wisdom and poetry, but also of war and cunning. He inspired leaders and poets alike, yet he was also feared for his deceptions and manipulations. His hunger for knowledge was relentless. He gave up one of his eyes at Mimir's well to gain wisdom. He hung himself for 9 nights on the cosmic tree Yggdrasil, pierced by his own spear, to seize the secret of runes. These sacrifices revealed the Norse belief that wisdom was costly, that to gain insight, one must endure suffering and loss. To the Norse chieftains, Odin embodied strategy and leadership, but also the willingness to sacrifice for knowledge, no matter the price. If Odin was wisdom and sacrifice, Thor was strength and protection. Wielding his mighty hammer Mjolnir, Thor defended gods and humans alike against the giants, embodiments of chaos and destruction. Each clap of thunder was his hammer striking, each storm his presence felt in the skies. Thor was beloved by farmers and common folk. He was dependable, a straightforward defender, a protector of hearth and field. His battles against the giants mirrored the struggles of every Norse family against hunger, storms, and loss. Thor was not cunning, but he was steadfast. He represented the courage to stand against overwhelming odds, hammer in hand, never yielding. Freya was among the most revered goddesses, embodying a richness of roles: love, fertility, beauty, magic, but also war and death. She received half of the slain warriors from battle into her hall, Sessrumnir, while Odin claimed the other half for Valhalla. Freya's independence and power reflected the place of women in Norse society: respected, autonomous, and vital. She was not a passive goddess of beauty. She was a force of will, embodying both tenderness and ferocity. To women, she was a model of strength and agency. To men, she was a figure of awe and reverence. Then there was Loki. Neither fully god nor giant, he was the trickster, the shapeshifter, the cunning voice of chaos. Loki was not purely evil, nor purely good. He solved problems with cleverness one day and caused disasters the next. His schemes could save the gods, but his betrayals would ultimately doom them. In Loki, the Norse saw the ambiguity of their own world. He was the wildfire that cleared and destroyed, the storm that could shift fortunes without warning. He was unsettling but necessary, a reminder that life itself was unpredictable, always on the edge of order and chaos. Holding all of this together was Yggdrasil, the world tree. Vast beyond imagining, its roots and branches stretched across the 9 worlds. Asgard of the gods, Midgard of humans, Jotunheim of the giants, and others, each realm bound together in a fragile balance. At its roots dwelled the Norns, the weavers of fate. These 3 figures, Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, spun the threads of past, present, and future. They tended the well of fate, watering Yggdrasil so it might endure. Yet even Yggdrasil was not eternal. It too would one day tremble and wither. For the Norse, fate, Wyrd, was inescapable. Even gods could not defy it. But fate was not pure doom. Within its weaving was room for choice, for courage, for action. A man could not avoid death, but he could choose how to meet it, with fear or with honor. This understanding lay at the heart of Norse life. Destiny is woven, but one's response defines one's worth. If creation began in chaos, it would also end in chaos. The Norse vision of the end times was Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. The signs would come: the great winter, Fimbulwinter, lasting 3 years with no summer between. Brothers would turn against brothers. Wolves would devour the sun and moon. The seas would rise, releasing the serpent Jormungandr. Fire would consume the skies. The gods would march to their final battle against the giants and monstrous beasts. Odin would be swallowed by Fenrir, the great wolf. Thor would slay Jormungandr, but die from its venom. Loki would stand against the gods, bringing ruin as foretold. And yet, within this grim vision was not despair but courage. For the Norse, Ragnarok was inevitable. There was no escape, no salvation. Even the gods would fall. But their worth lay in facing this end with unflinching bravery. To fight though doomed, to endure though fated to fall, this was the highest honor. This belief resonated deeply with the people of the North. Life was fragile, winters were long, death was certain. But like their gods, they would meet it with strength, with defiance, with courage that outlasted hope itself. In much of Europe during the early Middle Ages, laws came from kings, decrees carried by messengers, enforced by knights. But in the North, where no single ruler held all power, law belonged to the people. The heart of Norse governance was the Thing, an assembly of free men. It was more than a court. It was a parliament, a gathering, a stage upon which disputes were aired, laws recited, and decisions made for the community. The Thing was held in open air, often on a plain or a hill, sometimes by sacred stones or under ancient trees. Men would travel days to attend, bringing with them grievances, questions, and hopes. Presiding over the gathering was the law speaker, or Skummer. In a world where few wrote words on parchment, the law lived in memory. The law speaker was its guardian. Standing before the assembly, he recited the laws aloud, piece by piece, ensuring the community never forgot the traditions and judgments that bound them together. His role was not to rule, but to remind, to anchor the gathering in custom and continuity. At the Thing, disputes might be settled by testimony and witness, by compromise or fine. Decisions might be reached about trade, defense, or alliances. Though not all voices were equal, thralls could not attend, and women rarely spoke in such assemblies. The Thing was still a place where collective participation mattered. It was democracy in its earliest, rawest form. A society that believed law must be spoken aloud, heard by many, and agreed upon in sight of the gods and the earth itself. The society that gathered at the thing was layered, but not rigidly so. Unlike the deep hierarchies of feudal Europe, the Norse lived in a structure both flexible and practical. At its heart stood the carl, the free farmer. The carl tilled the earth, tended livestock, built homes, and sailed the seas. He was not wealthy, but he was independent, the cornerstone of Norse life. A carl might own his own land or rent it from a chieftain. He could trade, travel, even join raids. His worth was measured not by noble birth, but by skill, honor, and his ability to support his household. The carls were the majority, and their strength gave Norse society its resilience. They were not peasants bound to land, but free men with voices in the thing. Above the carl stood the jarl, the chieftain. Yet the jarl was no feudal lord, sitting upon absolute authority. Instead, he was first among equals. His power depended not on divine right, but on his deeds. A jarl needed to be generous. Wealth hoarded was shameful. Wealth shared through feasts, gifts, and rewards for followers brought loyalty and renown. A jarl's hall was a place of gathering, where warriors feasted, skalds sang, and plans were made. His role in battle was equally important. Victory brought him respect, defeat brought doubt. If a jarl failed too often, his men might leave him for a stronger leader. Power was therefore fragile, always dependent on his ability to protect, to provide, to inspire. At the bottom stood the thrall, the slave. Thralls were captured in raids, born into servitude, or sometimes sold into bondage by misfortune. They worked the hardest tasks, farming for others, tending herds, cutting wood, rowing ships. And yet, the life of a thrall was not without hope. A thrall could sometimes earn freedom, either through faithful service, purchase, or the goodwill of a master. Once freed, he might become a carl, building a new life for his descendants. This structure, jarl, carl, thrall, was firm yet flexible, bound more by deeds than destiny. A society where the ladder could sometimes be climbed, where honor and strength could shift one's place in the world. Within this hierarchy, women held a surprising strength. Compared to their counterparts in Christian Europe, Norse women had remarkable legal autonomy. A woman could own property. She could inherit land. She could even initiate divorce if her husband proved unworthy or cruel. Her position was not one of silent obedience, but of partnership in survival. The symbol of her authority was the keys at her belt. They were more than tools to open doors. They were emblems of control over the household's stores, wealth, and management. While men might fight or farm, women ensured that resources were preserved, that feasts were prepared, that trade goods were managed. Marriage itself was often strategic, a weaving of alliances between families. But within the home, a woman's voice carried weight. She could advise her husband, negotiate with neighbors, and act as guardian of her children's inheritance. In the sagas, women appear as sharp-tongued, wise, sometimes fierce figures, urging sons to battle, advising kings, and ensuring that honor was upheld. They were not passive shadows, but active players in the story of the Norse. If the thing provided the framework of law, the true currency of daily life was honor. To a Norseman, or a Norse woman, reputation was everything. Honor was not an abstract virtue, it was survival. A man with honor could call others to his aid. A family with honor could secure alliances. A woman with honor ensured her children's rightful place in the community. To insult someone's honor was dangerous. Words could spark feuds as fiercely as weapons. To defend honor was to defend life itself. This culture of reputation created stability. People behaved with respect because to do otherwise risked shame. But it also created volatility, for any slight might ignite cycles of revenge. In this way, Norse society balanced on a knife's edge, bound together by the invisible threads of honor. Each action weighed against how it would echo in the songs and stories told by others. In a land without police, without prisons, how was justice maintained? The answer lay in two systems, blood feud and wergeld. A blood feud was the rawest form of justice. If a man was slain, his family was bound by honor to seek vengeance. Blood must be answered with blood. To fail to avenge a wrong was to live in shame. Yet endless feuding could tear communities apart. So alongside this violent impulse came a pragmatic solution. Wergeld, the man price. Each life carried a value, carefully calculated in silver. A jarl's life was worth more than a carl's more than a thrall's. If a killing occurred, the guilty party could offer wergeld to the victim's family, a payment that transformed a debt of blood into a debt of silver. This system did not erase grief, but it prevented destruction. It acknowledged the pain of loss while preserving the fragile balance of the community. Thus, justice in the Norse world was both harsh and practical, rooted not in laws carved into stone, but in living customs, spoken aloud at the thing, enforced through honor. Wood was the lifeblood of the North. From the forests of pine, birch, and oak came nearly every tool of daily life. At the center of Norse architecture stood the longhouse. It was more than a building. It was the beating heart of family, community, and survival. Long and narrow, with walls of timber and roofs of turf or thatch, the longhouse stretched across the landscape like a sturdy ship on land. Inside, the longhouse was dim but alive. Smoke curled upward from the central hearth, escaping through holes in the roof. Along the sides were benches, lined with furs, where families slept together for warmth. At the ends, stalls held animals in the winter, their body heat adding to the shelter's warmth. The longhouse was not just a dwelling but a world of its own, where generations lived, ate, worked, and told stories through the dark winters. From the same timber came wagons to carry goods, plows to cut stubborn soil, bowls, spoons, and chairs for the home. The Norse carpenter was versatile, part builder, part engineer, part artist. With axe and adze, he could shape beams for a hall, ribs for a ship, or delicate toys for a child. Wood was everywhere, and with it the Norse shaped not only their homes but their future. Perhaps the greatest achievement of woodcraft was the boat. At first, these vessels were simple dugouts, hollowed from single logs. But in time, carpenters learned to join planks with iron rivets, bending them into elegant curves that could slice through water. These early plank-built boats were the ancestors of the longship. Small fishing craft, river boats, ferries across fjords, they taught the Norse how to harness wood and water together. In them was the seed of a revolution that would carry the Vikings across oceans. If wood was abundant, iron was precious. It had to be coaxed from the earth itself, a laborious process that turned mud into metal. Scandinavia lacked great mineral deposits, but scattered across wetlands lay bog iron. Deposits of iron were formed by the slow action of groundwater. Farmers would dig it from marshes, black lumps heavy with potential. To turn this raw material into usable iron required smelting. In clay furnaces, charcoal fires were stoked until the ore bloomed into spongy masses of iron, known as blooms. It was dirty, smoky, backbreaking work, but from it came the foundations of tools, weapons, and nails for ships. The blacksmith was both craftsman and magician. With hammer and anvil, he shaped the bloom into blades, hinges, rivets, and ornaments. His forge glowed like Muspelheim itself, and from its heat came the lifeblood of Norse technology. One of the blacksmith's greatest techniques was pattern welding. By twisting and layering strips of iron and steel, he created blades that were strong yet flexible, resistant yet sharp. These weapons shimmered with patterns along their length, flowing like waves or lightning. To own such a blade was to hold both beauty and power. Iron was never wasted. Every nail was precious, every rivet reused. But in the blacksmith's hands, even scarcity became opportunity, forging not just tools but a reputation for quality that would echo across Europe. While men often worked with wood and iron, the craft of textiles lay largely in women's hands. It was no less vital, for in a land of winter, clothing was survival. Sheep provided wool, abundant and warm. Flax grew in fields, offering fibers that could be spun into linen. Women carded and spun these raw materials into yarn, then wove them on the warp-weighted loom. This loom, standing upright, allowed threads to hang weighted by stones or clay. Back and forth went the shuttle, weaving wool and flax into sturdy cloth. It was slow, patient work, often done by firelight, the sound of the loom's rhythm echoing like a heartbeat in the longhouse. The garments they made were practical, layered for warmth. Men wore woolen tunics, trousers bound with leg wrappings, cloaks fastened with brooches. Women wore long dresses over linen shifts, with aprons held by pairs of oval brooches that often became treasured heirlooms. These clothes were not the horned costumes of modern imagination. They were durable, engineered for survival, but also handsome, dyed with natural colors, reds from madder, blues from woad, yellows from birch bark. Every stitch was both necessity and expression, a testament to the women who clothed their families against the biting northern winds. Though born of practicality, Norse craft often reached into art. Even the humblest object might bear decoration, as if to say that beauty and meaning should be woven into life itself. From the earliest centuries, Norse artisans developed distinctive animal styles, serpents twisting into endless knots, beasts with staring eyes and snapping jaws, limbs stretched into intricate patterns. A sword hilt might be covered in writhing designs, a chest carved with intertwined animals, a woman's brooch cast with spirals and knotwork. These were not idle ornaments, but expressions of a worldview where everything was connected, where chaos and order intertwined like the coils of a serpent. Everyday objects thus became more than tools. They were art, identity, and reflection of the Norse spirit. As villages grew and skills deepened, specialization began to emerge. Some men became renowned for boat building, others for ironwork. Some women wove fine fabrics prized in distant markets. Trade carried their crafts beyond the fjords. Across the Baltic, amber flowed, gleaming golden and warm. From the south came glass beads, bronze ornaments, even silver. The Norse did not simply copy these foreign goods, they adapted them, blending foreign influence with their own traditions. Thus, a new richness entered their world. A necklace might carry beads from the Baltic and pendants from home. A sword might bear southern steel joined with northern patterning. Through this blending, Norse craft grew both broader and more distinctive, preparing them for the networks of trade and raiding that would soon define the Viking Age. For centuries, Europe had been ruled by Rome. Roads stretched like veins across the land, connecting provinces to the heart of the empire. Cities thrived, trade flourished, and professional armies enforced order. But by the 5th century, Rome had fallen in the west. Its legions were gone, its roads crumbling, its cities shrinking into shadows of their former selves. Stone aqueducts stood silent, bridges decayed, and once busy marketplaces were overgrown with weeds. In place of centralized authority came fragmentation. Local rulers, warlords, and petty kings emerged. Defense was no longer the task of great standing armies, but of scattered militias, hastily assembled when danger appeared. Trade contracted. The Mediterranean still pulsed with commerce, but in the north, networks grew thin. Luxury goods became rarer, and many regions turned inward, focused on subsistence rather than exchange. It was a Europe less connected, less defended, less prepared for a new threat that would not come by land but by sea. Yet amid the ruins of empire, new powers rose. Chief among them were the Franks, a Germanic people who carved out a kingdom in the heart of Western Europe. By the 8th century, the Carolingian dynasty had taken command. Charles Martel, remembered as the Hammer, had defended Christendom from Muslim expansion at the Battle of Tours. His grandson, Charlemagne, Charles the Great, would build an empire rivaling Rome itself. Charlemagne's reign brought order and expansion. He conquered Lombards in Italy, Saxons in Germany, and stretched Frankish influence from the Pyrenees to the Danube. In 800, he was crowned Emperor of the Romans by the Pope, reviving the idea of a Western Empire. With this consolidation came wealth. Royal estates expanded, cities revived, and above all, monasteries flourished. These monasteries were not just centers of prayer. They were treasuries of silver, libraries of knowledge, and storehouses of goods. Protected by faith rather than fortifications, they shone like beacons of prosperity in a world still finding its footing. Unwittingly, the Franks had created irresistible lures, concentrations of wealth, famous across Europe, yet ill-prepared for the storms that would come from the north. Across the sea lay the British Isles, divided and contested. Here, too, the collapse of Rome had left behind a mosaic of kingdoms. The Anglo-Saxon realms, Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, Wessex in the south, vied for supremacy. Each rose and fell in turn, forging alliances, waging wars, and ruling over shifting borders. Beyond them lay Celtic lands, the Welsh in the west, the Scots in the north, the Irish across the sea. Amid this political patchwork, a golden age of monasticism flourished. From Lindisfarne on the rugged coast of Northumbria to Iona on a tiny island off Scotland, monasteries became spiritual and cultural powerhouses. They were rich not only in faith but in treasure. Gold and silver adorned their altars. Jewel-encrusted gospels were kept in their libraries. Monks copied manuscripts, turning them into repositories of learning that preserved the wisdom of ages. Yet for all their wealth, these holy places were defenseless. Monks prayed but did not fight. Their walls were low, their doors wooden, their reliance on faith greater than on swords. And many sat upon coasts or riverbanks, where the sea lapped at their very thresholds. To men from the north, sailors and warriors both, they were like ripe fruit waiting to be plucked. Christianity had spread across Europe, shaping not only faith but society itself. It brought literacy, governance, and unity, binding kingdoms to the authority of Rome and the Pope. It transformed kings into God's chosen, monasteries into power centers, and bishops into advisors of rulers. Yet it also introduced vulnerabilities. Christian ethics prized forgiveness over vengeance, peace over blood feuds. Clergy often discouraged martial responses, urging rulers to defend faith through prayer rather than the sword. This worldview clashed with the raw pragmatism of the Norse. Where the North valued honor, vengeance, and strength, the Christian world valued humility, patience, and restraint. It was a difference that would make monasteries easy prey for raiders who knew no such hesitation. The very success of Christianity in building centers of wealth and culture also made those centers visible targets. The Norse, with their longships and hunger for plunder, would find in Christianity not only a new foe, but a new opportunity. By the late 8th century, Europe was a continent in transition. The Roman roads were broken, armies were local, kingdoms were fragmented. Yet wealth was gathering again, in the treasuries of monasteries, the estates of kings, the markets of towns. This wealth was concentrated, predictable, and poorly defended. Monasteries sat on lonely coasts. Estates rose along rivers. Merchants traveled familiar routes. At the same time, political fragmentation prevented swift, unified responses. While the Franks grew strong, the British kingdoms fought each other as much as outsiders. Defense was overwhelmingly land-based. Few rulers considered the sea a threat. Harbors were open, coasts unwatched, rivers unguarded. Europe, in short, had created the perfect storm of opportunity. Wealth glittered along its shores. Divisions fractured its kingdoms. Armies were slow to muster, faith was reluctant to fight, and the sea, long ignored, was a door left unlocked. And just beyond that door, in the fjords of the north, a people were ready. They had longhouses and forges, myths and honor, skills in wood and iron. They had boats that could ride rivers and seas alike. They had courage, hunger, and restless ambition. The stage was set. Europe was vulnerable. The Norse were prepared. Soon, the two worlds would collide, and history would remember the moment when longships first appeared on the horizon. The land had shaped them. The gods had inspired them. But the Viking Age did not begin with a single decision or on a single day. It was not as though one spring morning the Norse awoke and decided to take to the seas. Rather, it was the release of pressures that had been building for generations, social, political, and economic forces gathering until they could no longer be contained. This is the story of those pressures, the storm inside Scandinavia that drove its people outward. For centuries, the Norse had adapted to their harsh homeland. They had learned to coax crops from thin soil, to herd sheep and cattle, to fish and hunt, to preserve every resource. They had survived, and more than that, they had thrived. But success carried its own dangers. Slowly, steadily, the population grew. Families that once clustered in longhouses expanded, generations deep. Children survived winters that might have claimed them in earlier times. Villages grew larger. Farmsteads spread across valleys, fjord edges, and clearings in the forest. Yet the land did not grow. Arable soil was scarce, and what little existed could only be divided so far. Inheritance and settlement carved the farms smaller and smaller, until each strip of land strained to support those who worked it. It was as though the land itself could no longer contain the people it had shaped. The delicate balance between nature and survival began to tilt. Scarcity, once the crucible of resilience, became a trap. Inheritance made this pressure worse. The Norse knew the danger of endlessly dividing farmland. It would render each portion too small to sustain life. And so, the system of inheritance often favored the eldest son, who would receive the farm and keep it whole. This preserved the family estate, but created another problem. What of the younger sons? They were not without skills. From childhood, they had learned to wield axe and spear, to hunt and fish, to sail and build. They were every bit as strong, proud, and ambitious as their elder brothers. Yet they had no land, no inheritance, and few prospects. These younger sons formed a restless, volatile class, a generation of men with everything to prove and little to lose. Many hired themselves out as warriors, bodyguards, or laborers. Some followed chieftains in hopes of plunder. Others brooded, angry at the unfairness of fate. A household could contain them for a time, but not forever. Their ambitions pressed outward, hungry for land, wealth, and honor that their homeland could no longer offer. At the same time, the political world of Scandinavia was changing. For generations, the Norse lived under the rule of local chieftains, jarls whose authority rested on loyalty, generosity, and success. But in the late 8th century, ambitious kings began to rise. especially in Denmark and parts of Norway. These kings sought to consolidate power, gathering lands and warriors under their banners. Where once power was dispersed, now it became concentrated. Chieftains who resisted were crushed or forced aside. Some swore fealty reluctantly. Others fled, taking their families and followers to seek new lands, new bases of power, new beginnings. This created a class of displaced leaders, experienced warriors and cunning strategists with no home, but still hungry for authority. They carried with them ambition, loyalty networks, and the drive to carve out new realms, if not in Scandinavia, then elsewhere. While these pressures built at home, tales of wealth drifted northward. Traders who ventured to the Frankish markets or the Baltic ports returned with stories, and sometimes with treasures. Silver coins stamped with strange faces, golden chalices, fine weapons and cloth. In a world where farms yielded little more than subsistence, this wealth was dazzling. The Norse valued silver above all, portable, divisible, a symbol of both power and prestige. With silver, a man could buy land, equip a ship, or host feasts to gather loyal followers. With silver, a chieftain could rise. And silver was not just dreamed of, it was reachable. The monasteries of Britain and Ireland, the markets of the Franks, the river towns of the Slavs, all lay a few days' sail away. They were known to be rich, and equally known to be poorly defended. For a carle scraping life from stony soil, or a younger son with no inheritance, or a displaced chieftain seeking new glory, the contrast was stark. A lifetime of toil at home might barely sustain survival. A single expedition abroad might change one's destiny forever. And so the forces gathered. The land could no longer sustain its growing population. Younger sons chafed with no inheritance, no prospects, and restless ambition. Chieftains, displaced by rising kings, sought new realms of influence. Traders whispered of silver and treasure waiting just beyond the horizon. Each of these pressures might have been endured alone, but together they created an unstoppable momentum. The Norse world was bursting at the seams, ready to spill outward. The longhouse could no longer hold its sons. The fjords could no longer feed their families. The old political structures could no longer contain ambitious leaders. The solution was clear, though it would transform history: take to the sea. With their plank-built boats already tested, with their knowledge of rivers and coasts, with their courage forged in survival, the Norse were uniquely prepared. They did not set out as conquerors at first, but as men seeking opportunity, release, and wealth. The Viking Age was not born of greed alone, nor of violence for its own sake. It was the inevitable answer to a question their homeland had asked. What happens when a people too strong for their land must find room elsewhere? And so, the longships were launched. For centuries, northern peoples had built boats, dugouts from single logs, plank-built craft that could fish or ferry across fjords. But these early vessels were bound to coasts and calm waters. They could not trust the open sea, nor challenge the unpredictable winds. Then came a single, transformative innovation: the keel. The keel was the backbone of the ship, a long central timber running the vessel's length. Earlier boats had shallow hulls without this spine, making them unstable in rough seas. But the Norse perfected the true keel, deep enough to steady the ship, strong enough to bear its weight, yet still shallow compared to the deep hulls of Mediterranean galleys. With the keel, the longship became something new. It could cut through waves without capsizing. It could sail against the wind by tacking, rather than being forever at the mercy of currents. It was stable enough for the open ocean, yet nimble enough for rivers. The keel turned fragile boats into seaworthy vessels. It was the skeleton that carried the future, yet the keel alone was not enough. The North Sea was unforgiving, the Atlantic worse still. Waves could shatter rigid hulls, storms could rip ships apart. The Norse answered this with a unique method: clinker construction. Instead of fitting planks edge to edge, they overlapped them like the scales of a fish. Each plank was fastened with iron rivets, hammered through and clenched tight. The result was a hull both light and incredibly strong, yet, most importantly, flexible. When waves struck, the hull bent and flexed with the water rather than breaking against it. The longship did not resist the sea. It moved with it, absorbing its force and gliding forward. The sound of such a ship at sea must have been a living thing. The creak of planks, the hiss of water, the steady rhythm of oars. It was technology married to nature, resilience crafted from wood and iron. Clinker construction was not just engineering. It was artistry born of survival, turning fragility into strength. With keel and clinker hull, the longship could endure the sea. But endurance alone was not enough. To master the waters, it needed power. The Norse found this power in a marriage of two forces, sail and oar. The large, square sail, woven from wool and often dyed in bold colors, transformed the longship. With it, the ship could harness the wind to cross vast distances. A single voyage that might take weeks by, or could be made in days with a favorable breeze. But the Norse were not content to rely on the wind alone. Along the sides of the ship were banks of oars, long, sturdy, manned by warriors and farmers alike. When the wind faltered, the oars gave speed. In rivers, where sails were useless, the oars carried the ship forward. In battle, they gave sudden bursts of motion, surging toward an enemy or darting away before pursuit could begin. This hybrid propulsion was unmatched. The Mediterranean relied on great fleets of rowed galleys, slaves chained to benches. Other northern ships depended only on sails, but the longship combined both, giving it unrivaled versatility. With sail and oar together, the Norse could travel where they pleased, when they pleased, no coast beyond reach, no river beyond their grasp. The genius of the longship lay not only in its strength and speed, but in its adaptability. It was the perfect amphibious vessel, equally at home on ocean waves, shallow rivers, or beached upon the sand. The keel was deep enough to steady the ship, but shallow enough to allow it to sail in waters barely a meter deep. Longships could slip far up rivers, past meadows and forests, deep into lands that believed themselves safe from the sea. Despite their size, longships were astonishingly light. Built of overlapping planks and careful joinery, they could be hauled onto beaches with ease. When rivers ran shallow, they could even be carried overland, portage from one waterway to another, bypassing obstacles that would halt any other fleet. And unlike most ships, longships were symmetrical fore and aft. There was no fixed bow or stern. This meant they could reverse direction instantly, simply turning the oars. For raiding, this was a weapon. Hit swiftly, then retreat just as fast before defenses could gather. Each of these features gave the Norse a strategic advantage unmatched in Europe. Armies defended land. Castles guarded roads. But rivers and coasts lay open, vulnerable to ships that could appear without warning, strike, and vanish. As shipbuilding flourished, specialization emerged. Not every voyage was a raid, not every journey a war. The Norse built ships for every purpose. The warship, the long, narrow, sleek design we think of as the classic longship, was built for speed and carrying warriors. Its low sides made it fast to embark and disembark, perfect for sudden strikes. But there were also broader, deeper vessels known as Nar. These were the cargo ships of the Norse world, built for trade and colonization. With wide beams and deeper hulls, they could carry livestock, goods, and families. It was in these ships that the Norse carried not only warriors but settlers, pushing west to Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. Together, these ship types made Norse expansion possible. Raiding, trading, colonizing, all flowed from the mastery of shipbuilding. It is difficult to overstate the longship's importance. It was not just a vessel, it was a revolution in mobility, a technology centuries ahead of its time. The longship made the Norse unpredictable. No coast was safe, no riverbank secure. A monastery hidden in a cove, a town far inland, even the heart of empires. All could be reached by ships that slipped silently along rivers, then fled as swiftly as they came. It was the perfect tool for a people under pressure, a people hungry for land and wealth. The longship was the release valve for their ambitions. It turned restlessness into opportunity, hunger into conquest, survival into dominance. Without the longship, the Viking Age might never have come. With it, the world opened before them. In much of Europe, warfare was becoming the realm of specialists. Knights, heavily armored horsemen, were beginning to emerge, their training and equipment so costly that only the wealthy could bear it. Ordinary peasants had little role beyond tending fields and paying taxes. But in Scandinavia, it was different. There were no knights, no professional armies. Instead, almost every free man was expected to fight. The Norse farmer knew the weight of an axe, for he used it daily on wood and field. The fisherman knew the pull of the oar and the sharpness of a knife. The trader traveled armed, for danger lurked on every path. Weapons were not luxuries, they were necessities, carried as naturally as a pouch of tools. This meant that when a chieftain called for a raid, or a king mustered men for war, the pool of warriors was vast. Not elite soldiers, but everyday men who already knew the basics of combat. The society itself was martial, not in rigid training, but in constant readiness. The Norse world produced not an army of specialists, but a culture where every man could, if needed, take up arms. The strength of the Norse warrior lay not in lavish equipment, but in practicality. Their weapons were tools of both daily life and war, simple, effective, and deadly. The spear, weapon of the many. The spear was the most common weapon of all. Cheap to make, simple to use, versatile in battle, it was the weapon of the everyman. A wooden shaft, tipped with iron, could be thrown as a missile or thrust in close combat. In the shield wall, rows of spears bristled outward, forming a deadly hedge against enemies. Some spears were plain, others finely wrought, but all served the same purpose: to extend a warrior's reach and give him both offense and defense. If the spear was common, the axe was iconic. Born from the woodsman's tool, the axe became a weapon of fearsome power. Short-handled axes could be wielded in one hand, striking with precision or hurled as throwing weapons. Longer-handled axes, like the later Dane axe, could split shield, armor, and man with a single swing. The axe symbolized the Norse warrior's pragmatism, useful in the home, devastating in battle. Its curved blade could hook an enemy's shield, tear away defenses, and open a path for the kill. It was not the weapon of nobles but of common men, a tool elevated into an emblem of their fighting spirit. Among the arsenal, one weapon stood apart: the sword. To own a sword was to possess wealth and status. Forged with pattern welding, its blade shimmered with rippling designs, beautiful and deadly. Balanced and sharp, it was not only a weapon but a symbol, a mark of the jarl, the chieftain, the wealthy warrior. Swords were given names, passed through generations, buried with their masters. They carried weight not only in battle but in honor. To fight with a sword was to stand among the elite, though even the poorest warrior might dream of wielding one. Together, spear, axe, and sword created the toolkit of the Norse raider. Simple yet versatile, accessible yet, at its highest level, exquisite. Weapons alone did not define the Norse warrior. His defense was equally shaped by pragmatism, favoring speed and mobility over heavy protection. The round shield was universal. Made of wood, rimmed with iron or rawhide, and bearing a central metal boss, it was both protection and weapon. In skilled hands, the shield was alive. It parried blows, deflected spears, and absorbed strikes. But it could also attack, shoved into an enemy's face, slammed against his body, or used to trap his weapon. This shield punch turned defense into offense, keeping foes off balance. The shield was not passive but active, the partner of axe or spear, as much a weapon as any blade. Unlike knights in mail and plate, most Norse warriors wore little armor. A leather tunic, perhaps padded with wool, was common. Mail armor was rare, a prize for the wealthy. Helmets, too, were precious, simple iron caps with nose guards, nothing like the horned fantasies of modern myth. This was not a weakness, but a choice. Armor was expensive and heavy. By leaving it aside, the Norse gained speed. They could march longer, move faster, strike swiftly. In raids, this advantage was decisive. They could attack before defenders mustered, retreat before reinforcements arrived. Their defense was not in steel but in mobility, surprise, and skill. Though often imagined as wild berserkers, the Norse were disciplined fighters. Their greatest formation was the skjoldborg, the shield wall. In this tactic, warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, forming a wall of wood and iron. Spears thrust from behind, axes reached over the top, while the front line braced against the enemy's charge. The shield wall was both defense and offense. It could hold against cavalry, resist arrows, and grind slowly forward, pushing enemies back with relentless pressure. It turned a band of farmers into a single organism, a line that could not be broken without cost. Within the shield wall, courage was shared. No man stood alone. Each shield protected his neighbor. To break the formation was shame, to hold it was honor. This discipline gave the Norse a strength far greater than numbers. It was not chaos but unity that made them so formidable. Yet beyond weapons and tactics, the true edge of the Norse warrior lay in his mind. Honor was life. To fight bravely brought renown, to falter brought shame. Songs would remember the courageous, and ridicule would haunt the coward. In a society where reputation was survival, this drove men to extraordinary feats. Religion added another layer. To fall in battle was not to end, but to begin anew. In Valhalla, the Hall of Odin, where slain warriors feasted and fought forever. To die with a weapon in hand was to claim eternal honor. This belief made them fearless. Where others fought to avoid death, the Norse could embrace it, certain that glory awaited beyond. Among them were those who fought with terrifying abandon, the berserkers. Clad in furs, consumed by frenzy, they charged without fear, howling like beasts, striking with feral strength. Whether from ritual, trance, or intoxication, their madness unsettled even seasoned foes. The berserker was more than a warrior. He was a psychological weapon, breaking the enemy's courage before blades even met. Together, honor, faith, and fury made the Norse warrior more than flesh and blood. He was a figure as much of spirit as of muscle, unyielding, relentless, and feared. But the Viking Age did not begin in a sudden blaze of fire and blood. Before the world knew their name, the Norsemen had already been moving outward, quietly, steadily, testing the waters beyond their fjords. They were explorers before they were raiders, traders before they were conquerors. And in these early ventures, they learned the secrets that would soon shake Europe. Long before longships struck the shores of England or France, Norse sails had already crossed the Baltic Sea. The Baltic was their first school of expansion, a sheltered inland sea, ringed by the lands of Slavic and Finnic peoples. Here, the Norse learned the rhythms of trade and navigation, the ways of diplomacy and conflict. They established early trading posts along the coasts and rivers. Places like Grobina, on the coast of modern Latvia, show traces of Scandinavian settlement as early as the 7th century. These were not great colonies, but footholds, places where Norse merchants exchanged furs, amber, and iron for grain, honey, and above all, silver. For from the east came rivers that flowed deep into the continent, connecting them to the great trade networks of the Islamic world. Norse traders followed the Dvina and the Volga, discovering routes that led to the rich markets of the Abbasid Caliphate. Arabic silver coins, dirhams, began to flow north, carried back through Baltic posts to Scandinavia. Silver was more than wealth. It was the key to loyalty, to prestige, to power. And the Baltic taught the Norse how to find it, how to carry it, how to trade for it, or take it. In these eastern waters, they honed their navigation, learning how to read currents and winds. They practiced diplomacy with foreign peoples, learning how to strike bargains or enforce demands. And they built the first networks that would later extend all the way to Russia, Byzantium, and beyond. The East was their first classroom. The West would be their proving ground. If the Baltic taught them to trade, the North Sea taught them where to raid. Here, the dominant merchants were the Frisians, skilled sailors who carried goods between the Frankish world, Britain, and Scandinavia. Their ships were sturdy, their networks vast. Wherever trade passed, Frisians were present. The Norse did business with them, trading furs, walrus ivory, and amber for wine, cloth, and silver. But these peaceful exchanges were also opportunities for learning. From the Frisians, the Norse gained intelligence. They heard stories of Frankish monasteries, laden with treasure but thinly defended. They learned of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, divided among themselves. They studied the currents of the North Sea, the harbors of the Channel coast, the estuaries of great rivers like the Rhine and the Thames. Sometimes these contacts were less than peaceful. Norsemen were known to test Frisian merchants, seizing ships or raiding poorly protected markets. In doing so, they learned the strengths and weaknesses of their competitors. Through commerce and conflict, the Frisians unknowingly armed the Norse with knowledge that would soon be turned against their own customers and allies. Beyond Norway's coast lay islands, the Orkneys, the Shetlands, and farther still, the Faroes. To the Norse, these were not distant lands but natural stepping stones. By the late 8th century, Norse settlers were already arriving in Orkney and Shetland. Some came to farm, carving homesteads into windswept hills. Others came as exiles, pushed out by rival kings or chieftains. Still others came for strategy, recognizing that these islands were perfect outposts for launching deeper ventures into Britain and Ireland. From Orkney, the coasts of Scotland lay within easy reach. From Shetland, the route to the Hebrides, the Irish Sea, and the northern shores of England opened wide. These islands became forward bases, safe harbors where ships could resupply, where families could settle, and where raiders could gather before striking farther afield. It was an expansion that felt natural, incremental, yet it gave the Norse the reach they needed. When the first great raids began, they did not come from distant Norway alone, but from these new Norse isles, already woven into the fabric of Viking power. History remembers Lindisfarne, but it was not truly the first. Long before the chronicles recorded Viking raids, small-scale attacks almost certainly occurred. A fishing village on a lonely coast, a farmstead by the sea, a monastery not yet famous enough to be noted in annals. These were the unwritten raids, strikes so small they left no mark in history, but which were crucial training for what was to come. These raids carried little risk. A handful of ships could land, seize livestock, grain, or treasure, and vanish before locals could respond. Each time, the Norse perfected their methods: how to beach a ship swiftly, how to form a shield wall in tight ground, how to retreat as quickly as they arrived. These were rehearsals. Each raid taught lessons in timing, in speed, in discipline. And each built the confidence of men who realized that the world beyond their fjords was not impregnable, but vulnerable, waiting. By the time Lindisfarne fell, the Norse were no novices. They had been practicing for decades, striking in ways that left only whispers in the wind. Knowledge did not flow only through trade or raids. Many Norsemen traveled farther afield, serving as mercenaries or guards in foreign wars. In Frisia, Francia, and even among the Saxons, Norse warriors fought as hired men. They learned firsthand the strengths of European armies, their reliance on heavy cavalry, their slow mustering, their rigid hierarchies. They saw the wealth of royal estates and the rhythms of monastic life. Others traveled eastward, joining Slavic war bands or venturing toward the steppe. Still others moved south along trade routes, bringing back stories of lands where silver flowed like rivers and gold adorned even the poor. Every journey, every service, every contract of mercenary labor added to the Norse mental map of Europe. They returned home with not only silver but stories, where the rivers ran, where the fortresses stood, where the weaknesses lay. By the late 8th century, Scandinavia was saturated with this knowledge. It was like water filling a dam, pressing higher and higher until the barrier would break. When we look back, the Viking Age seems to erupt suddenly, as if longships simply appeared from the fog and terror began. But the truth is more subtle. For decades before Lindisfarne, the Norse had already been reaching outward, east to the Baltic, west to Orkney and Shetland, south to the Frisians, and into the hidden corners of Britain's coast. They had already been raiding, trading, settling, and serving abroad. They had tested their ships, their weapons, their tactics. They had built forward bases, secured allies, gathered intelligence. They had turned exploration into confidence, and confidence into preparation. By 793, when their sails appeared off Lindisfarne, the Norse were not leaping blindly into the unknown. They were stepping boldly into a world they already understood, ready to exploit its wealth and its weaknesses. Now, the Norse world stood at the edge of transformation. All the forces of land, sea, craft, and culture converged. What had long been potential was about to become action. The Viking Age was waiting to be born. For their first great strike, the Norse needed more than just wealth. They needed a target that was both rich and vulnerable, one that would prove to their people, and to the world, that the risks of crossing the open sea were worth it. They found it on the coast of Northumbria, on a small tidal island called Lindisfarne. Lindisfarne was no ordinary settlement. Founded in the 7th century, its monastery was a beacon of Christian learning. From its scriptorium came illuminated manuscripts like the Lindisfarne Gospels, adorned with jeweled covers and intricate artistry. Pilgrims traveled to its holy site, bringing offerings of silver chalices, reliquaries, and gifts to honor Saint Cuthbert, whose remains rested there. The monastery's fame stretched far across Christendom. Its reputation for holiness was matched only by its accumulation of wealth. To the Norse, hungry for silver and treasure, it shone like a beacon. Yet for all its wealth, Lindisfarne was defenseless. The monks who lived there were men of prayer, not war. Its walls were low, built for shelter, not defense. It had no garrison, no militia, no watchtower. The island itself seemed safe only because of its isolation, surrounded by tidal waters, accessible only at certain times. To Christian minds, that remoteness made it secure, blessed, untouchable. To Norse minds, it made it perfect, an island target, vulnerable to the sea, the very element they commanded. Perhaps most crucial of all was the psychology of the place. For the Christian world, monasteries were sacred, protected by God Himself. To attack such a site was unthinkable, beyond the boundaries of imagination. But to the Norse, pagan and practical, the monks' faith meant nothing. Sacredness was not protection. It was vulnerability. What Christians thought untouchable, the Norse saw as ripe for the taking. In this contrast of worldviews lay the monastery's doom. Lindisfarne was rich, isolated, and undefended. It was the perfect target. Up to this point, Norse expeditions had been small, opportunistic. A quick strike on a village, a seized ship, a raid that vanished before defenders could gather. These were tests, practice runs, training missions. But Lindisfarne was different. To strike such a place required planning. It meant gathering more ships, more men. It meant crossing the North Sea, a voyage of days, not hours. It meant coordination and risk on a new scale. This was no longer chance, it was choice. A deliberate act of strategy. The Norse leaders weighed the risks and rewards. On one side, the danger of the open sea, the possibility of storms, the chance of encountering armed resistance. On the other, the lure of immense wealth, the fame that would follow, the proof that the sea was not a barrier but a road. The calculation was clear. Lindisfarne would be their target. Such a strike required leadership. A man of charisma and vision who could gather crews from different fjords, persuade farmers to leave their fields, inspire warriors to risk their lives. His name has been lost to history, swallowed by the mists of time. But someone, or perhaps several someones, stood tall and convinced others to follow. The call went out, and ships gathered. In a quiet fjord, longhouses buzzed with preparation. Men sharpened spears and axes. Carpenters checked the planks of the longships. Blacksmiths hammered rivets, mended shields, forged arrowheads. Women wove sails and prepared provisions, dried fish, barley bread, ale and skins. Younger sons, eager for glory, rushed to join. Seasoned warriors, hungry for silver, tightened their belts. Chieftains, seeking to prove themselves, brought their household men. Each had their own reasons: ambition, need, desperation, faith in fate. But together they formed a single purpose. For the first time, the Norse were not raiding as individuals or small bands. They were forming an expedition, coordinated, deliberate, ambitious. At last, the day came. The ships were ready, the men aboard. The tide shifted, and the longships slipped from their beaches into the fjord. Picture it, a dozen ships, perhaps more, their prows carved with dragons and serpents. Woolen sails billowed, striped red and white, catching the northern wind. Oars dipped in rhythm, pulling them out to sea. On shore, families watched, some with pride, others with fear. Women held children, elders lifted hands in farewell, all knowing that the men who left might not return. But all understood why they went. The land was full, the world beyond was open, and silver awaited across the waves. As the fleet moved from the fjord into the vastness of the North Sea, there was no turning back. Behind them lay the tight valleys of Norway, the crowded farms, the restless politics of rising kings. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and promise. This was the moment of ignition, the spark striking tinder, the potential energy of generations converting into movement, into action, into history. The Viking Age had not yet begun in the chronicles of monks. But in the spray of salt against their faces, in the creak of planks and the snap of sails, the Norse knew it had begun already. It was early summer, June 8th of the year 793. On Lindisfarne, the Holy Island, the day began as countless others had. The tide was low, the cries of seabirds echoed across the sky, and the monks of St. Cuthbert's monastery filed into their chapel for prayer. Their lives were quiet, ordered, devoted to God. They did not yet know that, on this day, the world would change forever. It began with shapes on the horizon. At first, they seemed like shadows, black lines rising and falling with the swell of the sea. But as the minutes passed, the shapes grew sharper. Sails, striped and square, caught the wind. Prows, carved into dragons and serpents, cut through the waves. Long, sleek ships, unlike any the monks had seen before, surged closer. The monks watched from the shore, confusion clouding their faces. Traders? Pilgrims? Visitors from afar? But no merchant ships bore such fearsome figures on their prows. No pilgrim ships came so many or so fast. Then came the oars, flashing in unison, biting the water with terrifying speed. The realization struck too late. These were not peaceful men. These were raiders. The longships slid into the shallows, their keels needing so little depth that they ran directly onto the sand. Warriors leapt over the sides, shields in one hand, axes and spears in the other. Their movements were disciplined, practiced. There was no hesitation. On Lindisfarne, confusion became panic. The monks scattered, some fleeing toward the chapel, others toward the tidal flats. But there was nowhere to hide. The sea that had always protected them had brought their doom. The warriors moved swiftly across the island. Their boots struck the soft earth. Their voices roared in harsh, foreign tongues. The monks, unarmed and untrained, could do nothing but pray. The raiders surged into the monastery. Wooden doors splintered beneath axes. The cloisters filled with shouts and screams. What had been a sanctuary of prayer became a battlefield. In the chapel, monks clung to the altar, their voices trembling with hymns. But steel cut through song. Blood splashed across stone. Holy relics, once revered, were trampled beneath boots. Chalices were ripped from altars, gospel books torn from their jeweled covers. For the monks, this was not just violence, it was sacrilege. To spill blood in the house of God, to defile the altar, to strike down men consecrated to prayer. Such acts were beyond imagination. To them, it was as though the Northmen were not only killing men, but attacking God himself. The clash of cultures was absolute. One side believed in sanctity, the other in opportunity. For the Norse, there was no sin here. There was only silver and gold, waiting to be taken. The raiders moved with cold precision. This was no frenzy, it was methodical, practiced. They stripped the monastery of anything of value. Silver chalices, golden reliquaries, jeweled covers torn from manuscripts like the Lindisfarne Gospels. Iron fittings, bronze candlesticks, ivory combs. Anything that could be carried was taken. The monks themselves became part of the harvest. Some were slain outright. Others were bound, dragged in chains toward the waiting ships. They would be sold in the slave markets of Scandinavia, or farther still, in Frisia, in the Baltic, even in the great cities of the East. Livestock was driven onto the beaches. Grain stores were broken open, provisions seized. The monastery was not just a holy place. It was a storehouse of wealth, food, and resources. It was plunder in its purest form, efficient, ruthless, and complete. As swiftly as they came, the Northmen departed. Their ships, heavy with treasure, captives, and spoils, slid back into the sea. Their oars bit the water once more, their sails caught the wind, and they vanished over the horizon. What they left behind was ruin. On Lindisfarne, the earth was littered with the slain. The chapel's floor was stained with blood. Holy relics lay broken, their sanctity shattered. Smoke drifted from smoldering timbers. Survivors wept over the bodies of brothers, their voices trembling with grief and confusion. How could this happen? How could God allow his holy place to be desecrated by pagans? Was it punishment? A test? Or had the protection of heaven failed? The survivors grappled not only with trauma, but with a crisis of faith. The world they knew, that sanctity meant safety, that holiness meant protection, had been torn apart in a single morning. News of the raid spread swiftly, carried by survivors, pilgrims, and the shocked voices of the faithful. Across Northumbria, across Britain, across Europe, the cry was the same. The Northmen had come. The scholar Alcuin of York, horrified, wrote to the king of Northumbria, "Lo, it is nearly 350 years that we and our fathers have inhabited this most lovely land, and never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. Nor was it thought possible that such an inroad from the sea could be made. Behold, the church of St. Cuthbert spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments. A place more venerable than all in Britain is given as a prey to pagan peoples." These words capture the horror. The unthinkable had happened. A holy place had been defiled, priests slain, treasures stolen. The sea, once a boundary of safety, had become a highway of terror. The raid on Lindisfarne was not the first Norse attack, but it was the first to be recorded, remembered, and feared. It struck not just a monastery, but the heart of Christian imagination. It announced that the Northmen were not distant shadows, but a present threat, and that no coast, no monastery, no holy site was safe. This single raid sent shockwaves across Europe. It marked the true beginning of the Viking Age, not because it was the first, but because it was unforgettable. Across the restless waters of the North Sea, the longships cut their way home. Their sails were heavy with wind, their hulls heavy with plunder. Inside the ships lay silver chalices, golden reliquaries, jeweled book covers, ivory combs, bolts of cloth, and sacks of grain. Bound captives, monks and laborers alike, huddled in fear, knowing they faced slavery in foreign lands. The warriors meanwhile sang. Their voices rose with the rhythm of the oars, their spirits lifted by victory. They had proven themselves not just to their chieftains, but to their gods, their families, and to fate itself. When the ships slid back into the fjord, the scene was triumphant. Families gathered on the beaches to meet them. Children gasped at the treasures, women wept at the sight of loved ones returned, elders nodded at the proof that the sea could indeed yield riches. Then came the division of spoils. According to custom, the leader of the expedition, the chieftain or jarl, took the largest share. After him, the distribution was made according to rank, deed, and oath. A man who had fought bravely might receive a gilded chalice. Another might take home a silver coin, a slave, or a fine weapon. This sudden flood of wealth transformed communities. Where once barter and scarcity ruled, silver now jingled in pouches. Men who had owned nothing but a patch of soil now returned as wealthy heroes, their reputations remade overnight. The raid had not only enriched them, it had elevated them, reshaping the social fabric of their homeland. The lesson was unmistakable. For years, younger sons had chafed at having no inheritance, chieftains had struggled against rising kings, and farmers had wrestled with stony fields that gave so little. Now, in a single season, men had returned from across the sea with more wealth than years of toil could produce. The effect was electrifying. Young men saw their neighbors return clad in foreign cloaks, drinking from silver cups, boasting of victory and honor. They saw men who had been poor rise in standing, courted by women, respected by elders, sought after by leaders. It was proof of concept, the ultimate demonstration. Raiding was no longer a risky experiment. It was a proven path to wealth, fame, and advancement. The logic was irresistible. Why struggle for years to carve a living from the earth when a few weeks at sea could transform one's life? Why wait for inheritance when the sea offered fortunes? Why submit to kings and jarls at home when one could make one's own fortune abroad? And so the cycle began. The Lindisfarne raiders had not only enriched themselves, they had inspired others. Every fjord, every hall, every longhouse now buzzed with the same thought. If they could do it, so can we. What had begun as one raid would now become a flood. While the Northmen celebrated, the other side of the sea wept. In Northumbria and beyond, the raid was not merely a tragedy, it was a crisis of the spirit. To the Christian mind, monasteries were sacred, protected by God Himself. To see one violated so utterly was incomprehensible. The response was primarily theological. Bishops and abbots did not call for armies, they called for repentance. They declared that the attack was God's punishment for sin, a chastisement for pride, greed, or impurity within the church and kingdom. Across Britain, and even in Frankish lands, sermons thundered with warnings. Fasting was ordered, prayers multiplied, processions held. Men turned inward, searching their souls for sin. But while they prayed, the sea remained undefended. This was the first great gap of the Viking Age. The Northmen saw opportunity, the Christians saw punishment. The invaders thought in terms of wealth, logistics, and timing. The victims thought in terms of sin, salvation, and divine will. The difference left them vulnerable. Still, some rulers understood that action was needed. Kings and nobles began to muster defenses, but their measures were inadequate. They posted watchmen along the coasts, hoping to raise alarms at the sight of sails. They ordered local militias to be ready, farmers to take up spears when danger approached. In some places, they fortified towns or built wooden palisades. But these defenses were landbound, slow, and predictable. They assumed an enemy that would come by road, camp on fields, and fight pitched battles. The Northmen fought differently. They arrived swiftly by sea, struck before defenders could gather, and vanished before militias even assembled. Watchmen could raise alarms, but what good was an alarm when the raid was over within hours? Fortifications helped in towns, but monasteries on lonely coasts lay far beyond their reach. The Anglo-Saxons and Franks tried to apply old solutions to a new problem. Their defenses could not match the speed, mobility, and unpredictability of the longship. At the heart of this failure was a deeper misunderstanding. European leaders thought of war in terms of conquest, seizing land, holding fortresses, expanding kingdoms. To them, an enemy must be met on a battlefield, defeated in combat, and driven away. But the Northmen were not trying to conquer, not yet. They sought wealth, not land. Their campaigns were economic, not territorial. Raiding was armed commerce, carried out with blades instead of contracts. This made them hard to understand. Why would men strike, loot, and vanish rather than claim land? Why would they risk the sea for silver instead of planting roots in the soil? The answer was simple to the Norse, because silver was portable, immediate, and powerful. To a society of younger sons, restless warriors, and ambitious chieftains, it was far more useful than a strip of foreign farmland. But to the rulers of Christendom, this logic was alien. They tried to respond with armies, but armies were too slow. They tried to interpret the raids through theology, but theology did not stop ships. It was not just a military problem, it was a cultural one. Europe simply did not yet understand what it was facing. At first, there had been only a few ships. A dozen at Lindisfarne, perhaps a handful more along other coasts. Small bands, opportunistic, quick to strike and vanish. But by the early 9th century, the trickle became a flood. Each spring, as the ice broke and the seas opened, fleets gathered in fjords. Not one or two ships, but dozens. Sometimes entire communities emptied their younger men into the longships. By summer, the North Sea churned with sails. To the people of England, Ireland, and Francia, it seemed as though the horizon itself had become dangerous. Any morning might bring dragon-proud shadows against the rising sun. Any estuary might echo with the beat of oars. The North Sea, once a barrier, was transformed into what some later called a Viking lake. A highway owned by men who could appear anywhere, at any time, leaving fire and fear in their wake. From the beginning, the Vikings recognized the wealth of the Irish Church. Ireland was a land of monks and monasteries, and unlike England, it had no single kingdom strong enough to protect them all. The first great Irish shock came in 795, when raiders struck the island of Iona, the sacred heart of Celtic Christianity. The monastery there had been famed for centuries, its scribes producing masterpieces, its pilgrims spreading across Europe. To see it attacked, its treasures carried off, was unthinkable. Yet it was only the beginning. The Irish coast was dotted with monasteries, rich, exposed, and within easy reach of longships. Places like Armagh, Clonmacnoise, and Glendalough became targets. Each raid brought home relics, chalices, and captives, feeding the growing hunger of the Norse. The Irish political landscape made it worse. Dozens of rival kings ruled small territories, constantly at war with one another. None had the unity or resources to stop the raiders. Sometimes, in fact, Irish kings hired Viking bands as mercenaries against their rivals, a desperate bargain that only deepened the cycle of violence. To the Norse, Ireland was a gift, a land of fragmented rulers, overflowing with monasteries, and surrounded by seas their ships commanded. Even the mightiest kingdom in Europe was not safe. The Frankish Empire under Charlemagne stretched from Spain to Germany, from Italy to the North Sea. Its armies were vast, its rule organized, its prestige unmatched. But even this superpower was vulnerable. The Norse discovered that the Frankish coastline was long, and its rivers broad. They began to probe, landing at estuaries, raiding villages, testing defenses. They struck places like the island of Noirmoutier off the Atlantic coast, plundering and retreating before Charlemagne's armies could even march. For all his power, Charlemagne could not defend every stretch of coast, every river mouth, every monastery. His armies were designed for campaigns against Saxons and Lombards, not for a fleet of longships that could appear and vanish in days. The most powerful ruler in Europe faced an enemy he could not easily defeat. The Norse had found the cracks in even the strongest walls. With each year, Viking raids became more organized. They learned that a single strike was wasteful when a season could be exploited. So they began to establish long forts, temporary fortified camps, often on islands, riverbanks, or coastal promontories. From these bases, they could repair ships, store loot, and plan multiple raids. A summer camp meant that one fleet could terrorize an entire region for months. They would strike one monastery, retreat to their camp, then strike again the next week, sometimes deep inland. Their shallow draft ships carried them far up rivers like the Seine, Loire, and Thames, places once thought safe from the sea. To European defenders, it was a nightmare. The Vikings were no longer mere raiders. They were seasonal occupiers, turning coastal zones into hunting grounds. This shift marked a crucial step in the evolution of Viking warfare. They were no longer striking and fleeing, they were lingering, exploiting, and expanding. At first, monasteries were the prime targets, but soon the Norse realized there was more wealth to be found. Europe's trade networks were beginning to recover after the fall of Rome. Small towns known as wicks had sprung up, places like Dorstad in the Netherlands, Hamwick in southern England, and Ribe in Denmark itself. These towns bustled with merchants, exchanging goods from across the continent. To the Norse, they were irresistible. Dorstad, one of the greatest ports of the Frankish realm, was attacked repeatedly. Hamwick was plundered. Even trading centers they themselves had once visited as merchants became targets for raids. This was not random violence. It was strategic. The Vikings were learning to identify the arteries of Europe's wealth, the towns and markets that sustained kingdoms. They were not merely plundering, they were disrupting entire economies, siphoning wealth directly into their own hands. By the 830s, the Norse had transformed from opportunistic raiders into systematic predators, exploiting Europe's prosperity with precision. For the people of Europe, the change was devastating. What had begun as an isolated horror at Lindisfarne had become routine. Every spring brought new raids. Every summer carried rumors of sails on the horizon. Every autumn left behind burned farms, empty monasteries, missing kin. At first, there was disbelief, then terror. But by the mid-9th century, fear of the Northmen became a permanent part of life. Sermons thundered about repentance, kings scrambled to defend coasts, villages prayed that the sails would pass them by. The Vikings were no longer a rumor or a surprise. They were a season, as regular as winter storms or summer harvests. The great change came in the middle of the 9th century, somewhere along the coast of England. Some say on the Isle of Thanet, others on the banks of Frankish rivers. A fleet of Vikings made a decision that would reshape history. They did not sail home in the autumn. They stayed. It was a decision of extraordinary audacity. The Norse were far from their homelands, deep in enemy territory. Winter meant storms, cold, and hunger. For generations, prudence had demanded a return home when the weather turned. But now, emboldened by decades of success, they chose otherwise. They built camps, fortified, defended, supplied, and remained where no enemy expected them. This was not just a tactical choice. It was a revolution. These winter camps were unlike anything Europe had seen before. They were not flimsy shelters, but strongholds. Often the Norse chose islands, where rivers met the sea, naturally defensible, with water on all sides. They fortified their perimeters with ditches and wooden palisades, stockades that turned raiders into occupiers. Within the camps, life took on a new rhythm. The longships were hauled ashore, their hulls repaired, their sails mended. Blacksmiths stoked forges, crafting rivets and spearheads. Stores of grain, livestock, and stolen goods were piled high. The camp was not only a shelter, it was a headquarters. From here, warriors could plan raids deep into the surrounding countryside, launch sudden attacks at dawn, and retreat to safety by night. It was a supply depot, a harbor, a barracks, and a fortress all in one. With these winter bases, the Vikings gained something priceless: permanence. The consequences for their enemies were devastating. Until now, defenders had endured the storm each summer, then breathed relief in winter. They could rebuild their monasteries, replant their fields, mend their walls, and prepare anew. But with Vikings overwintering, the cycle of respite was broken. There was no longer a safe season. The threat was constant, unending. In the cold months, when armies were dispersed and food scarce, the Norse were still present. When spring came, they were ready before defenders could gather. When autumn arrived, they lingered, striking late into the year. Kings could no longer predict their enemy. Farmers could no longer trust in peace. The Vikings had turned raiding from a season into a permanent reality. Europe was no longer fighting summer storms. It was enduring a winter without end. Within these camps, another transformation occurred. In the early years, Viking fleets had been collections of independent bands, each loyal to its own chieftain, each raiding for its own profit. But in the crucible of the winter camp, these disparate groups were forced to live, fight, and survive together. They shared food. They repaired ships side by side. They planned joint raids, defended their walls as one, and learned to cooperate on a scale never before attempted. This cooperation forged something new: a larger, more cohesive Viking army. It was here that the foundations of the great heathen army were laid, the massive coalition that would, in time, sweep across England, not merely raiding but conquering. The winter camp turned raiders into soldiers, bands into armies, ambition into invasion. The Norse had discovered that by staying, they could not only plunder but also build power. For the people of Europe, the sight of a permanent Viking camp was more than a military threat. It was a psychological earthquake. Imagine being a villager, seeing dragon-prowed ships on the river not in June, but in December. Imagine watching smoke rise from a campfire on the horizon, knowing it was not your neighbors but pagan warriors who now lived on your soil. It was demoralizing in ways that cannot be overstated. The people had trusted their kings to protect them. Now, permanent enemies camped openly within their borders. Whole regions were abandoned as peasants fled inland. Farmers left their fields and tilled, unwilling to risk feeding the invaders. The sense of safety, of order, of divine protection, all collapsed. To live under the shadow of a Viking camp was to live with despair. It was proof that the storm was no longer passing, but settling, spreading, and growing stronger each day. The decision to overwinter was one of the most significant shifts in the Viking Age. No longer were the Norse seasonal raiders, bound by weather and distance. They had become a permanent force year-round, embedded in the lands they struck. Their enemies could no longer breathe, could no longer recover. In those winter camps, the Vikings found their foothold. From them, they would launch deeper campaigns, carve out kingdoms, and begin the work not only of raiding but of conquest. The prelude was over. The age of permanent Viking presence had begun. The great heathen army was unlike anything England had ever seen. It was not a handful of ships, nor even a seasonal force. It was a coalition, bands of Norsemen from Denmark, Norway, and perhaps even Sweden, united under charismatic leaders. At its head were names that would echo through legend. Ivar the Boneless, master strategist, feared for both his mind and his mysterious infirmity, and Halfdan Ragnarsson, his brother, a warrior of ruthless strength. They were said to be sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, the semi-mythical Viking hero whose death at the hands of the Northumbrians had, according to sagas, spurred this great invasion. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle does not give numbers, but later writers speak of thousands, far more than any previous raid. Enough to be not a nuisance, but a national threat. They came with longships brimming with men, weapons, supplies. They came with ambition not just for plunder, but for land, power, and conquest. England, divided into its four great kingdoms, Northumbria, East Anglia, Mercia, and Wessex, was about to face its greatest trial. The army first landed in East Anglia, a small kingdom on the eastern coast. They did not come to fight, not yet. They came to bargain. The East Anglians, too weak to resist, provided them with horses. It was a shrewd move by the Vikings. Within weeks, they had transformed from seaborne raiders into a mounted army, swift and mobile across land. Their true target lay north. In 866, the army marched on York, the heart of Northumbria. At the time, Northumbria was fractured by civil war, its two rival kings locked in a bitter struggle. The Vikings exploited this weakness with ruthless precision. They swept into York, capturing the city with speed and ferocity. The Northumbrian kings, setting aside their feud too late, attempted to retake it. The battle was a disaster. The kings were slain, their forces broken, and the once great kingdom of Northumbria collapsed overnight. The Vikings installed their own rule over York, turning the city into a base of power. For the first time, a great Anglo-Saxon kingdom had fallen, not to rival kings, but to pagan invaders from across the sea. It was a stunning reversal, the kind of catastrophe that would have seemed impossible only a generation earlier. Yet the great heathen army had only just begun. With Northumbria subdued, the army turned south. Its next target was the very kingdom that had given them horses, East Anglia. In 869, they descended upon it with overwhelming force. The East Anglian king, Edmund, chose to resist rather than submit. He gathered his men and faced the invaders. But against the sheer size and discipline of the Viking force, his army stood little chance. Edmund was captured. His fate became legend. According to later accounts, the Vikings tied him to a tree, scourged him, and shot him with arrows until his body bristled like a hedgehog. Then they beheaded him. His head was cast away, later miraculously recovered, guarded by a wolf, and buried with reverence. To his people, Edmund became Street Edmund the Martyr, one of England's most enduring saints. To Christendom, his death was a horror, a ritualistic killing that defied all norms of war. To the Vikings, it was a message. No king, no matter how holy, was beyond their reach. East Anglia was conquered. Its resistance ended in blood and sanctity. By the early 870s, the army turned its attention to Mercia, the central kingdom of England. Mercia had long been powerful, its kings rivaling Northumbria and Wessex for supremacy. But now Mercia faced a foe unlike any it had ever fought. The great heathen army moved with speed and cunning. They did not seek pitched battles unless they chose them. Instead, they marched, raided, and forced Mercia to respond. Each time, they exploited divisions, outmaneuvered defenders, and struck where least expected. At Nottingham, they fortified themselves, daring the Mercians and their West Saxon allies to attack. When a combined army gathered, the Vikings avoided open battle, negotiating instead on terms that favored their survival and strength. Again and again, Mercia was harried, pressured, and weakened. By 874, the Mercian king Burgred was driven into exile in Rome. The Vikings installed a puppet ruler in his place, reducing Mercia from a kingdom to a client. Another pillar of Anglo-Saxon England had fallen. Through these campaigns, one figure stood out, Ivar the Boneless. His name alone was strange, a reminder of his rumored deformity, perhaps disease, perhaps disability. Yet if his body was weak, his mind was unmatched. Ivar understood what few others did, that conquest was not about brute force alone, but about exploiting weaknesses. He saw that the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were divided, their kings mistrustful of one another. He struck where enemies were weakest, avoided battle when the odds were poor, and used negotiation, deception, and terror as freely as the sword. Where others sought glory in battle, Ivar sought victory in strategy. His capture of York, his crushing of Edmund, his manipulation of Mercia, all bore his mark. By the time the great heathen army was done, 3 of the 4 great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had fallen: Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. Only Wessex, in the south, remained unconquered, and it was there, in the kingdom of Wessex, that the fate of England would soon be decided. Wessex was not the largest of the Anglo-Saxon realms, but it was the strongest. Its kings had cultivated stability, its fields were fertile, and its wealth surpassed that of many rivals. Its position in the south and west also made it strategically vital. With Wessex conquered, the Vikings would control the entire island. England itself would be theirs, not just its monasteries and markets, but its crown, its soil, its people. The great heathen army knew this. And so, after the fall of Mercia, their full might turned southward. The fate of England now rested on Wessex. The storm fell with ferocity. Viking warbands poured into Wessex, their longships pressing deep into estuaries, their mounted warriors sweeping inland. The years of the 870s became a blur of battles. At Reading in 871, the West Saxons suffered a stinging defeat. Days later, at Ashdown, they rallied, catching the Vikings off guard and winning a famous victory. Yet even this triumph bled them dry, so many warriors slain that their strength dwindled. Other clashes followed, Basing, Marathon, Wilton. Each battle, whether won or lost, cost dearly. Unlike the Vikings, who could call upon reinforcements from across the sea, the Saxons had only their own men. Farmers and freemen called again and again to defend their homes. The chronicle records the year 871 as the year of battles. Yet despite their courage, Wessex was being ground down. Its people bled, its kingship wavered, its future darkened. Amid this struggle rose a figure who seemed, at first, unlikely to become a savior. Alfred, the youngest son of King Ethelwulf of Wessex, was not bred as a warrior. He was a prince devoted to learning, piety, and the wisdom of books. As a child, he had traveled to Rome, where the Pope had blessed him. He loved poetry, law, and prayer. But destiny is rarely gentle. As his elder brothers died one by one in battle against the Vikings, Alfred was thrust into leadership. He became king not by ambition, but by necessity. Though inexperienced in war, Alfred proved adaptable. He studied his enemies, learned from defeat, and drew strength from his faith. Slowly, the scholar prince was forced into becoming a commander. But the trial ahead would test him beyond all measure. In 878 came the greatest blow. The Viking leader Guthrum, cunning and ruthless, made a move few had expected. Winter had always been a time of rest, when armies dispersed and campaigns ceased. But the Vikings, who had already broken the cycle by overwintering, now broke it further. In the dead of winter, Guthrum launched a surprise attack. His army swept into Wessex while its defenders were unprepared, striking deep into the heart of the kingdom. The blow was devastating. Saxon defenses collapsed. Fortresses fell without resistance. Villages were seized. Panic spread like wildfire. Alfred himself barely escaped. Hunted and harried, he fled westward with only a handful of followers. His kingdom shattered, his army scattered, his throne usurped, Alfred became a fugitive. He found refuge in the marshes of the Somerset Levels, at a place called Athelney, a small island amid fens, bogs, and waters. Here, amid reeds and mist, the king of Wessex hid like a hunted fox. For the Anglo-Saxons, this was the darkest hour. Their last kingdom had fallen. Their king was a fugitive in the swamps. To many, it seemed the age of the Saxons was over, and the island belonged to the Norse. Yet in those bleak marshes, something remarkable happened. Alfred did not surrender. He did not flee across the sea. Instead, he began to gather the remnants of his people. Small bands of warriors slipped through Viking lines to join him. Peasants, still loyal, brought food and shelter. Messengers carried word that the king still lived. From Athelney, Alfred waged a guerrilla war. He struck from the fens, ambushing patrols, raiding supply lines, harassing Viking camps. His men melted into the marshes, vanishing where the Norse dared not follow. It was not grand battle, it was survival, resistance, a flame kept alive in the darkness. But that flame mattered. It told the people of Wessex that all was not lost. Their king still fought, their cause still lived, and in that crucible of mud and hardship, Alfred himself was transformed. The scholar prince became a hardened leader. a king not only by blood, but by struggle. He learned patience, resilience, and the art of inspiring men against impossible odds. The Norse believed they had broken Wessex. In truth, they had forged its greatest defender. From his refuge at Athelney, Alfred launched a new kind of campaign. He could not match Guthrum in numbers, nor meet him in open battle. But in the marshes, Alfred had the advantage. He knew the land, the bogs, the streams, the hidden causeways. His small band of loyal warriors struck like shadows, ambushing Viking patrols, cutting off supply lines, raiding camps at night, and vanishing back into the fens. To the Norse, the marshes were alien, treacherous ground. To Alfred, they were a shield. Each skirmish was small, but each carried meaning. Word spread through the countryside, the king still fights. Farmers who had thought all lost now knew resistance remained. Men began slipping away from villages to join him, swelling his hidden force. The guerrilla war was more than survival. It was a symbol. Alfred was showing his people that Wessex was not dead, that its king had not abandoned them, that the fight for their land still burned. By spring of 878, Alfred knew the time had come. Skirmishes could not save Wessex forever. If the kingdom were to survive, he would need to gather an army and face Guthrum directly. It was a gamble of staggering risk. Failure would mean the end of Wessex. But success might mean survival. From Athelney, Alfred sent out his riders. Across Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire they rode, carrying a summons to the FYRD, the militia of free men. Farmers, craftsmen, freemen, all were called to arms. The chosen meeting place was Egbert's Stone, a landmark that carried both symbolic and practical weight. It was a place where the Saxons could rally, a banner beneath which to reclaim their cause. When Alfred arrived, he found not despair but hope. The men came. From villages and farms they gathered, carrying spears, axes, and shields. They were weary, they were scarred, but they had answered their king's call. The chronicle speaks simply of this moment, but one can imagine the emotion. Men embracing after long months of fear, pledging themselves to one last defense of their homeland. Alfred, once a fugitive, now stood before a small army, his people's last hope. At Egbert's Stone, Wessex was reborn. The newly mustered army marched north to meet Guthrum's main force. They found the Vikings near a place called Eddington. There, on the slopes and fields, the fate of England would be decided. The battle began with the clash of shield walls. On one side, the Saxons, farmers turned warriors, rallied by desperation and faith. On the other, the Norse, battle-hardened raiders, veterans of conquest, their confidence high. Shields locked, spears thrust, axes swung. The two walls slammed together with a sound like thunder, men straining shoulder to shoulder, pushing, heaving, stabbing. The fighting was brutal, a grinding contest of endurance. For hours the lines surged and wavered. Each side fought not only with weapons, but with will, knowing that the battle's outcome would shape the destiny of kingdoms. Alfred's leadership was crucial. He urged his men forward, steadying them when the line faltered, pressing when the enemy weakened. The Saxons fought not only for their lives, but for their land, their families, their faith. As the day wore on, the Viking wall began to buckle. The Saxons pressed harder, their cries rising with fury. At last, the Norse line broke. Panic spread, warriors fled, and Guthrum's army was driven back in rout. The victory was complete. Against all odds, Alfred had triumphed. But Alfred was not finished. Military triumph was one thing, lasting peace was another. The defeated Viking army retreated to its fortress. Alfred laid siege, cutting off supplies, surrounding them with unyielding pressure. After weeks, starvation forced Guthrum to negotiate. What followed was Alfred's masterstroke. He did not simply demand ransom or tribute. Instead, he demanded transformation. Guthrum and his chieftains would not only surrender, they would be baptized into Christianity. At the ceremony, Alfred himself stood as Guthrum's godfather, renaming him Athelstan. In that moment, the Viking warlord was symbolically woven into the Christian political fabric of England. It was more than peace, it was legitimacy. Alfred had not just defeated Guthrum, he had remade him, binding him within a framework that placed the Saxons at the moral and cultural high ground. The agreement that followed, later known as the Treaty of Wedmore, divided England into two spheres, Wessex and the lands of the Saxons in the south and west, and the Viking-controlled regions in the north and east, later called the Danelaw. It was a compromise, yes. Alfred had not driven the Vikings from England, but he had secured survival for Wessex, safeguarded his people, and established a line that the Vikings recognized for now. The significance was profound. For the first time in decades, the Saxons could breathe. For the first time, there was the possibility of rebuilding. And for the first time, a vision of a unified, resilient England began to flicker. The victory at Edington was not just military. It was political, cultural, and spiritual. Alfred had proven that the Norse could be beaten, not only with swords, but with strategy, patience, and faith. The settlement that followed Edington was formalized in what became known as the Treaty of Wedmore and later, the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum. It carved England into two spheres of rule. In the south and west lay Wessex and its dependent territories, where Alfred's law, church, and authority held sway. In the north and east lay the Danelaw, a vast region stretching roughly from the River Thames northward to the Tees, and from the Midlands eastward to the sea. Here, Norse custom prevailed. The very word Danelaw meant the land where Danish law applied. It was a pragmatic acceptance that Alfred could not drive the Norse from England entirely. Instead, he secured peace by drawing a line across the island and recognizing the authority of Guthrum and his followers beyond it. It was not ideal, but it was survival. The Vikings had come not only to plunder, but to stay. And now, England itself bore the mark of their permanence. In the Danelaw, the warriors of the great army faced a transformation. No longer could they live forever by the sword alone. Many settled, becoming farmers, craftsmen, and traders. The Norse who had come to burn now plowed the fields, raised livestock, and built homes alongside the Saxons they had once conquered. This gave rise to a unique hybrid culture. Norse and Anglo-Saxon words blended. Norse legal customs influenced local governance. Place names across the north and east bear the mark of this era, villages ending in, by, farm, thorpe, hamlet, or thwaite, clearing, stand as echoes of the settler's tongue. The city of York, seized by the Vikings and renamed Jorvik, became the jewel of the Danelaw. Once a Roman stronghold and Saxon capital, it now flourished as a Viking metropolis. Merchants thronged its markets, craftsmen forged tools and jewelry, and ships carried goods along rivers and seas. Jorvik became one of the wealthiest cities in northern Europe, a center where Norse enterprise and Anglo-Saxon tradition fused into something new. Life in the Danelaw was neither wholly Norse nor wholly Saxon. It was a frontier society, forged by necessity, where two cultures mingled uneasily but productively. From this mingling would come some of the richest legacies of the Viking Age in England. While the Danelaw took shape in the north, Alfred in the south understood that peace could not be trusted. He had won at Edington, but the Vikings would return. To ensure Wessex's survival, he needed more than armies, he needed a system. His answer was revolutionary, the Burghouse system. Alfred ordered the construction of a network of fortified towns, or buzz, across Wessex. Each was carefully placed so that no person in his kingdom was more than a day's ride from safety. These were not simple refuges but permanent, organized strongholds with garrisons, markets, and defenses. The buzz created a defense in depth. If a Viking force landed, they could raid the countryside, but they could not take a fortified town easily. Farmers and villagers could retreat behind walls, slowing the invaders. Communication between buzz allowed reinforcements to be called swiftly. In effect, Alfred made it impossible for the Vikings to win quick, decisive victories. Where once they had burned undefended monasteries, now they faced walls, militias, and organized resistance at every turn. The buzz system was more than military. It created new hubs of trade, administration, and community, strengthening the fabric of Wessex itself. It was Alfred's greatest legacy of defense, a system that would endure for centuries. Fortresses alone were not enough. Alfred also reformed the way Wessex fought. The traditional Saxon militia, or FYRD, had been a part-time force. Farmers called up when needed, but often too late to stop Viking raids. Alfred reorganized it into a rotating system. One half of the force could serve in the field while the other half tended the crops, ensuring that there was always an army ready without starving the land. This innovation gave Wessex a standing force in all but name, flexible, sustainable, and better prepared to face the constant threat. Yet Alfred's boldest reform was on the water. He recognized that the Vikings' true advantage was the sea. As long as they controlled the rivers and coastlines, they could strike where they wished. To defeat them, Wessex needed ships. So Alfred ordered the creation of a new English navy. His ships were larger and higher-sided than Viking longships, designed to carry more men and stand taller in battle. They were built for interception, to meet raiders at sea before they could land, turning the tide of battle from land to water. Though imperfect at first, these efforts marked the birth of the English Navy, a force that, centuries later, would define the nation. Alfred saw that the struggle with the Vikings was not only about land and war. It was also about identity. He believed that England's weakness had come in part from its neglect of learning. The collapse of Roman order had left Latin scholarship waning, and few priests or nobles could read. Without knowledge, Alfred feared, the people had grown morally and spiritually vulnerable. To restore strength, he launched a cultural revival. He personally oversaw the translation of key Latin works into Old English, the Bible, histories, and treatises on law and philosophy, so that all who could read might access them. He invited scholars to his court, founded schools, and encouraged literacy among clergy and nobles. He himself studied and wrote, believing that wisdom was as necessary to a king as the sword. Through these efforts, Alfred sought to give his people more than survival. He sought to give them resilience, the strength of mind and spirit to endure beyond war. The Frankish Empire had long borne the weight of Viking pressure. From the mid-9th century, longships prowled its coasts and rivers, striking as far inland as Paris itself. The most dramatic moment came in 885, when a massive Viking fleet sailed up the Seine and laid siege to Paris. The city's defenses were formidable, stone walls, strong gates, and determined defenders under Count Odo. For months, the Norse battered at the city, launching assaults, burning bridges, and trying to starve it out. Yet Paris held. The defenders repelled repeated attacks, their courage becoming legendary. But while the city withstood the storm, the Frankish crown revealed its weakness. Emperor Charles the Fat, instead of crushing the Vikings, chose to buy them off, paying tribute and granting them leave to ravage Burgundy instead. This pattern repeated for decades: Viking pressure, Frankish payments, uneasy truces. Finally, in 911, a new king, Charles the Simple, struck upon a bold solution. At St. Clair-sur-Epte, he met with the Viking leader Rollo. Instead of endless war or tribute, Charles offered land. In exchange for peace and for Rollo's loyalty, he granted him a vast swath of territory along the lower Seine. This was the birth of the Duchy of Normandy, the land of the Northmen. It was a landmark moment. A kingdom of Christendom had not only yielded to the Vikings, but had absorbed them, transforming invaders into lords. Rollo and his followers adapted with astonishing speed. They accepted baptism, with Rollo himself taking the Christian name Robert. They swore loyalty to the Frankish king. They married into local aristocracy. Within a generation, they were no longer simply Norsemen, they were Normans. They adopted the French language, French law, and French customs. Yet they retained the energy, ambition, and martial skill of their Viking ancestors. In time, they became one of the most dynamic forces in European history. From their duchy, they expanded their influence, building castles, fields, and fleets. A century and a half later, their descendants would cross the English Channel under Duke William and conquer England itself. Elsewhere, they would carve kingdoms in Italy, Sicily, and even challenge the Byzantine Empire. The Normans were proof of the Viking gift for adaptation. From raiders, they became rulers, and from rulers, they became conquerors of an entirely new kind. While one branch of the Viking story turned south to Francia, another turned west, into the open ocean. For centuries, the Norse had hugged coasts and sailed familiar seas. But by the late 9th century, their longships carried them into the North Atlantic, a vast and perilous void. First came the Faroe Islands, scattered and windswept, lying midway between Norway and Iceland. These rocky outposts became stepping stones, places where sheep grazed on sparse grass and settlers found shelter against the endless sea. The voyage was daunting, but the Norse were driven by a mixture of hunger, ambition, and exile. For some, the lure was trade and land. For others, it was escape, from poverty, from feuds, or from kings whose power grew ever heavier at home. Most of all, it was curiosity. The Norse had always looked beyond the horizon. Now, the horizon lay farther west than ever before. Around 874, the first great wave of settlers reached the vast, uninhabited island of Iceland. Unlike the bloody conquests of England or Francia, this was a migration of opportunity. The land was empty, no kings, no armies, no monasteries. Only volcanic rock, fertile valleys, glaciers, and rivers. The sagas tell of Ingolfur Arnarsson, often named the first permanent settler, who built his hall at Reykjavik. Others followed in great numbers. By the end of the 9th century, thousands had crossed the sea to make new homes on this remote island. Why leave Norway for such a forbidding place? Many were driven by the centralization of power under King Harald Fairhair, who sought to unify Norway under his crown. Independent chieftains, unwilling to bow, fled westward with their families and followers, seeking freedom. In Iceland, they found what they sought: land without lords, valleys without kings. The society the settlers built in Iceland was unlike any other in Europe. There was no king, no single ruler. Instead, Iceland became a commonwealth of free farmers and chieftains, each holding local power, bound together in a loose web of alliances and rivalries. To maintain order, they founded the Althing in 930, a national assembly where disputes could be resolved, laws declared, and judgments given. It met in the open air at Thingvellir, a plain where cliffs and rivers framed a natural gathering place. The Althing was, and remains, the oldest surviving parliament in the world. It was a remarkable experiment in governance, a republic of chieftains, held together not by a king's decree, but by collective agreement. In this harsh land, where survival depended on cooperation, they created a society rooted in law, tradition, and the balancing of power. It was both deeply Norse and strikingly new. Unlike the open seas of the West, the East was a land of rivers, immense arteries flowing from the forests of the north to the Black Sea and the Caspian. The Dnieper wounds south through forests and plains, its waters tumbling toward the Black Sea and, beyond it, the Byzantine Empire. The Volga, vast and powerful, stretched toward the Caspian, carrying ships toward the Caliphate. Smaller rivers, Neva, Fokhov, Western Dvina, threaded the lands like veins, linking watersheds across hundreds of miles. For the Varangians, these rivers were highways, yet to use them required feats of endurance. Longships had to be hauled against currents, dragged over rapids, and at times, carried bodily across land in grueling portages between river systems. Crews lifted their vessels on rollers or slings, hauling them mile after mile through forests and marsh. It was punishing, backbreaking work, but it allowed the Norse to do what no one else could: knit together the north and the south, the Baltic and the Black Sea, Scandinavia and Byzantium. Along these rivers flowed a lucrative trade. The forests of the north yielded the finest furs, sable, marten, fox, and beaver, highly prized in Constantinople and Baghdad. Beeswax and honey, abundant in the Slavic lands, became vital exports for candles and food. But above all, the trade was in slaves. The Rus raided Slavic villages, capturing men, women, and children. These captives, bound and sold, became the human coin of Viking commerce. They were carried downriver and sold in the bustling markets of the south, feeding the insatiable demand of the Caliphate and Byzantium. In return, the Varangians received silver, millions of Arabic dirhams that poured into the north, discovered centuries later in vast hoards buried across Sweden and Russia. They brought back silks, wine, glassware, and ornaments, luxuries unimaginable in the wooden halls of Scandinavia. It was an economy of harsh exchange, fur, wax, and flesh for silver and silk, that bound the Varangians to the great civilizations of the south. The Rus began as traders, but soon became rulers. At first, they established fortified outposts along the rivers, places where they could store goods, defend themselves, and control trade. Over time, these posts grew into towns: Novgorod, Smolensk, Kiev. Each became a hub of commerce, culture, and power. The primary chronicle, a semi-legendary account, tells of the Slavic and Finnic tribes weary of constant conflict, inviting the Varangian chieftain Rurik and his kin to rule over them. "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come and reign over us, and be our princes." Rurik established himself in Novgorod, and his successors moved south to Kiev, creating the polity known as the Kievan Rus. This dynasty, founded by Norsemen, would endure for centuries, blending Norse leadership with Slavic culture to form the foundations of the Russian state. The Rus were no longer wanderers. They were kings. Yet for all the wealth of the rivers, the true magnet of the East was Constantinople, the city the Norse called Miklagard, the Great City. Nothing in the north could compare. Its walls stretched for miles, its harbors glittered with ships, its palaces shone with gold and mosaics. It was the greatest city in the Christian world, seat of the Byzantine emperors, a place of almost mythical wealth. The Varangians both coveted and feared it. Several times they launched audacious naval assaults. Longships swept into the Bosphorus, their sails filled with the southern wind, their warriors determined to plunder the richest city on earth. The Byzantines, with their massive walls and terrible weapon, Greek fire, a liquid flame that burned even on water, repelled them. But these attacks left their mark. The Byzantines learned to respect the Rus, and the Rus learned that, if they could not take Miklagard by force, they could profit through treaty. Trade agreements were struck, giving the Rus access to Constantinople's markets in exchange for peace. The great city, whether as foe or partner, was the lodestar of the Varangian world. From this wary relationship came something extraordinary. The emperors of Byzantium, impressed by the Rus' ferocity, began to recruit them as mercenaries. Over time, this evolved into the Varangian Guard, an elite corps of axe-wielding warriors who served as the emperor's personal bodyguards. For the Rus, it was a path to immense wealth and prestige. Young men left the forests of the north to serve in the marble palaces of Constantinople, fighting not only as guards, but as shock troops in imperial wars. Their loyalty was prized because, as foreigners, they had no ties to Byzantine factions. They served only the emperor. They carried great two-handed axes, their presence towering and fearsome in the gilded halls. Chronicles speak of them as incorruptible, ferocious, and utterly devoted. To stand among the Varangian Guard was to have reached the pinnacle of a warrior's life. Thus the Varangians, who had once come as raiders, now stood as protectors of the very city they had sought to plunder. The saga begins with Eric the Red, a man as fierce as the lands he conquered. Eric was born in Norway, but exiled with his family to Iceland after his father was outlawed for manslaughter. In Iceland, Eric followed a similar path. Hot-tempered and violent, he killed several men in feuds and was himself declared an outlaw. Banished, Eric looked west. He had heard whispers of lands spotted far beyond Iceland, glimpsed by earlier sailors blown off course. Gathering his courage and a small crew, he set out into the unknown. After days on the open ocean, they sighted a vast, icy coast, a place of fjords, mountains, and glaciers. Eric explored its inlets and valleys, finding patches of grassland and places where livestock might graze. When he returned to Iceland, he spoke of this new land with cunning. He called it Greenland, though much of it was white with ice. Men will be drawn there, he reasoned, if the land has a fair name. His gamble worked. In 985, Eric led a fleet of settlers westward. Not all ships survived the crossing, but enough did to found two colonies, the eastern settlement near modern-day Kakartok and the western settlement farther north. It was a feat of extraordinary daring. These were the most remote European colonies yet, perched at the edge of the habitable world. Life in Greenland was hard. The Norse settlers brought with them cattle, sheep, and goats, but the land could support only limited farming. Hay had to be carefully harvested each summer to feed animals through the long, brutal winters. To survive, the Greenlanders turned to the sea. They hunted seals on the ice, fished the fjords, and ventured into the Arctic to hunt walruses and polar bears. Walrus ivory, in particular, became their most valuable export, a luxury prized in Europe for carving and ornament. In exchange, traders from Norway and Iceland brought iron, timber, and grain. Without these imports, the colonies could not endure. Every ship that crossed the stormy North Atlantic was a lifeline. Greenland was a society on the edge of survival, yet it endured for centuries, a testament to Norse resilience and determination. Among Eric's children was a son named Leif Erikson, who would carry the saga even farther. Around the year 1000, Leif heard tales of new lands west of Greenland, reported by sailors who had sighted strange shores. Curious and ambitious, he gathered a crew and set sail into the unknown. They first reached a barren place of flat stones and cold winds. Leif called it Helgeland, land of flat stones. This may have been Baffin Island, in the Canadian Arctic. Sailing south, they came to a land of dense forests. Leif named it Markland, land of forests. Scholars believe this was likely Labrador, rich with timber lacking in Greenland. Finally, they reached a gentler place with wild grapes or berries, meadows, and milder climate. Here they established a camp. Leif called it Vinland, land of wine, or land of pastures. Most scholars identify it with Newfoundland, though the sagas hint they may have voyaged farther still. For the first time in history, Europeans had reached North America. Archaeology has confirmed the truth of these sagas. At L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, excavations uncovered the remains of Norse buildings, longhouses of turf and timber, ironworking sites, and artifacts unmistakably Scandinavian. Here, around the year 1000, Norse settlers lived, worked, and explored. They repaired ships, forged tools, and perhaps prepared for longer expeditions south. It was not a grand colony, but it was real. For a brief moment, Norsemen stood on the soil of a new continent, half a millennium before Columbus. Yet the Norse presence in Vinland was fleeting. The distances were immense. Greenland lay hundreds of miles away, and Norway farther still. Supplies were scarce, and every voyage across the Atlantic was perilous. More decisive still was the presence of the land's native peoples, the Skrælingr, as the Norse called them. Relations were tense from the start. At first, there may have been trade, but mistrust grew quickly and violence followed. The The sagas tell of clashes, arrows and stones against Norse steel. Though the Vikings were fierce warriors, they were few, and the Skrælingr were many. The Norse realized they could not hold this land against determined resistance. After only a few years, they abandoned Vinland. The camp at Lance aux Meadows was left behind. The dream of a new colony across the ocean surrendered. The greatest change of all was faith. For generations, the Norse had worshipped Odin, Thor, and Freya. But the slow, relentless spread of Christianity transformed Scandinavia. At first, it came through captives and missionaries, Irish monks in the north, Frankish priests in the south. Some chieftains toyed with the new faith for political advantage. Yet by the 10th and 11th centuries, kings saw Christianity as a tool for power. To rule as pagan warlords was to remain outsiders. To rule as Christian monarchs was to join Europe. Baptism meant recognition by popes and emperors, access to alliances and trade. The cross became not just a symbol of faith, but a weapon of legitimacy. In Denmark, King Harald Bluetooth proclaimed himself Christian around 965, famously boasting that he had made the Danes Christian on the Great Jelling Stone. In Norway, King Olaf Tryggvason and later Saint Olaf used fire and sword to enforce conversion, smashing idols and baptizing their subjects by decree. In Sweden, resistance lasted longer, but by the late 11th century the White Christ had triumphed there as well. Christianity centralized power and kingship, and weakened the old traditions of local chieftains and independent raiding. Pagan sacrifice gave way to church tithes, the thing assemblies bent to bishops and priests. The Norse world had entered Christendom, and in doing so, it lost the cultural foundations of its raiding age. Religion was only part of the change. Just as important was politics. For centuries, Scandinavia had been a patchwork of rival chieftains, fjord lords, and small kingdoms. Raiding thrived in this chaos, as ambitious men sought fame and fortune abroad. But in the 10th and 11th centuries, powerful kings emerged who sought to end this independence. In Denmark, kings like Knut the Great forged centralized power, ruling not only Denmark but also England and Norway in a North Sea empire. In Norway, Harald Fairhair's descendants built royal authority over the fractious jarls. In Sweden, dynasties linked to Uppsala extended their reach across the Mälaren Valley and beyond. These monarchs had no interest in seeing their subjects disappear overseas on private raids. They wanted taxes, armies, and order. They built churches, minted coins, and established royal law. The age of freelance raiders was incompatible with the age of kings. And as monarchs tamed the north, the wild spirit of the Viking Age was domesticated into the framework of medieval Europe. If the Viking Age had a dramatic final curtain, it came in England in the year 1066. That autumn, Harald Hardrada, king of Norway, launched one last great Scandinavian invasion. Hardrada was a warrior of legend. He had fought across Europe and served in the Varangian Guard in Constantinople. He came to England with dreams of conquest, seeking the crown. Landing in the north, his army defeated the local Saxon levies at Fulford. But only days later, at Stamford Bridge, they met the full force of King Harold Godwinson's Saxon army. The battle was fierce. The Vikings fought with their usual ferocity, but they were unprepared for the speed of the Saxon march. Caught off guard and cut down, Hardrada fell with an arrow to the throat. His army was shattered. Of the hundreds of longships that had brought them, only a handful returned to Norway. Stamford Bridge was a turning point. It was the last great Viking invasion of England, and it ended in defeat. Yet the irony was cruel. No sooner had Harold Godwinson triumphed than he faced another invasion, this time from the south. William, Duke of Normandy, crossed the Channel. William was descended from Rollo, the Viking who had been granted Normandy centuries before. At Hastings, Harold fell, and England was conquered, not by pagan raiders, but by the thoroughly Christian, French-speaking heirs of Vikings who had long since assimilated. Thus, the Viking Age in England ended as it had begun, with ships on the horizon. But these were not the longships of the fjords. They were Norman transports, carrying the new order of medieval Europe. This pattern was repeated across the continent. In Normandy, the descendants of Rollo spoke French, built castles, and became some of Europe's greatest warriors. In the Danelaw, Norse settlers merged with Anglo-Saxons, leaving behind place names, laws, and words, but fading into English identity. In the Kievan Rus, Norse dynasties ruled, but became Slavic in language and Orthodox in faith. Everywhere the Vikings had settled, they had transformed. Their children no longer spoke Old Norse but the tongues of their neighbors. They no longer worshipped Thor but Christ. They no longer sailed for plunder but built towns, farms, and kingdoms. The Viking Age ended not because the Norse were destroyed, but because they became part of the very world they had once raided. Yet even as Europe moved on, one outpost of the Viking world endured, Greenland. For centuries, the Norse colonies clung to the edge of survival, trading walrus ivory and hides, farming in the brief summers, and enduring the endless winters. But by the 14th and 15th centuries, the climate cooled, the Little Ice Age set in. Pastures shrank, sea ice grew, and trade with Norway dwindled. Archaeology tells the rest. Churches and farmsteads were abandoned, graves show signs of malnutrition, and the records fall silent. By the 15th century, the Norse of Greenland were gone, vanished into mystery. Some may have perished from famine, others merged with Inuit peoples, others perhaps sailed away. Whatever their fate, their disappearance marked the last chapter of the Viking world. The sails are gone from the horizon. The dragon-proud ships are silent. The longhouses, once filled with warriors boasting of raids and voyages, now stand beside churches, their smoke curling toward the cross instead of the gods of Asgard. The Viking Age has ended, yet its echoes remain. For though the longships no longer carve their wakes across the seas, the Norse left behind something far greater than fear. They left a legacy that reshaped Europe, that survives in nations, cities, languages, and even the blood of their descendants. This is the world the Vikings made. The Vikings were more than raiders, they were catalysts. Their relentless pressure forced kingdoms to unify, rulers to consolidate, and new nations to emerge. England. When the great heathen army descended upon the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in the 9th century, England was a fractured land. Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex each vying for supremacy. Viking conquest shattered 3 of the 4. Only Wessex endured, and under Alfred the Great and his heirs, it rallied the surviving English. Out of resistance was born unity. The English crown itself, the idea of a single kingdom stretching from Kent to Northumbria, was forged in the crucible of Viking invasions. France. On the Seine, Viking pressure reshaped Francia. Unable to expel them, King Charles the Simple granted Rollo and his men a duchy, Normandy. From there, the Normans rose to power, adopting French language and law while retaining Viking vigor. In 1066, it was they who conquered England, blending Norse ambition with French sophistication to alter the course of European history. Russia. To the east, the Swedish Varangians became rulers. From trading posts along the great rivers, they established the Kievan Rus, a dynasty that fused Norse leadership with Slavic culture. From this union emerged the roots of modern Russia and Ukraine. Scandinavia. And at home, wealth from raids and trade fueled consolidation. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden ceased to be patchworks of chieftains and became unified kingdoms. Kings like Harald Bluetooth and Olaf Tryggvason built monarchies that endured into the Middle Ages, integrating Scandinavia into the Christian world. The Vikings, once a destabilizing force, became midwives of nations. Though remembered for burning monasteries, the Vikings were also builders. Across the lands they touched, they founded towns that grew into cities still thriving today. In Ireland, Viking longforts, temporary camps, became permanent hubs. Dublin, founded around 841, grew into a bustling center of trade, its harbor filled with ships from as far as Spain and the Baltic. Cork and Limerick followed similar paths, their Norse roots still visible in street plans and archaeology. In England, the Viking capital of Jorvik, modern York, became one of the most vibrant cities in northern Europe, its workshops turning out combs, jewelry, and weapons, its markets bustling with furs, silver, and silk. The Vikings were also connectors. Their trade routes linked disparate worlds. From the Caliphate, they brought Arabic silver into Europe. From Byzantium, they carried silks and spices northward. From the Baltic, they traded amber and timber. Their network stretched from Baghdad to Newfoundland, binding together continents in a web of commerce. The Vikings were not merely raiders. They were merchants and urban founders, whose settlements still shape maps today. Their legacy lingers on the tongue as well. In English, the Norse contribution is enormous, a living reminder of the Danelaw settlers who merged with the Anglo-Saxons. Everyday words, plain, simple, vital, come from Old Norse. Law. These are not foreign borrowings, but part of the bedrock of English itself. Even the pronoun they is a Norse inheritance. The sound of modern English, its mixture of Germanic roots and Norse inflections, reflects the centuries when Saxon and Scandinavian lived side by side. Through language, the Vikings still speak. No less enduring is their spirit of exploration. Few peoples in history pushed boundaries so far. They sailed the North Atlantic, founding colonies on the Faroes, Iceland, and Greenland. They became the first Europeans in North America, 5 centuries before Columbus, leaving their mark at L'Anse aux Meadows. They journeyed east, threading rivers and portages, establishing the Kievan Rus, trading slaves and furs for silver and silks, standing in awe of Constantinople. Some became the Varangian Guard, bodyguards of the Byzantine emperors, their axes gleaming in the halls of power. Their curiosity, their willingness to risk everything on the unknown, expanded the map of the world. They were not only destroyers, but pioneers. And so we come to the image of the Viking, shaped by centuries of story and myth. The horned helmet, the bloodthirsty barbarian, the raider from the north. But the truth is richer. The Vikings were raiders and traders, yes, but also farmers and poets, lawmakers and explorers, builders and rulers. They sang sagas around fires, carved intricate art into wood and bone, built ships of unmatched design, and navigated oceans with skill beyond their age. Their age was turbulent, violent, and transformative. They brought fear and suffering, but also trade, innovation, and statehood. They left destruction, but also cities and dynasties. The Viking Age was not a barbarian interruption of history. It was a crucible of transformation, a chapter in which Europe was reshaped, accelerated, and set upon a new course.